Yep. A couple copies of the bigger report for people to share, and then
That's not you, that's Mike.
should be plentiful copies of the recent update from yesterday.
Peter, not going to be here. Me. Phil.
He's like, thank you, seriously.
Oh, are you a fan of the trackball?
Oh, I love it.
I love trackballs.
Yes. Although these are a little less reliable in the summer.
Yeah, I'm not in the waiting
It's
room
actually
quite.
cheaper. That actually works.
That used to be my go-to
I love
machine
these
right
still.
there. Yeah.
I love these.
All right.
So,
Oh. Thank you. There's Judy.
Gotcha.
Does the printer staple itself?
Yes, it does. There was an auto
Wrong
staple
place.
from the printer.
I was just wondering if I should
Where you're like, you need a fire.
if I should
She can't,
give somebody a hard time for it, or
We're gonna give you a hard time anyway.
Yeah, that's okay.
well, if you remember the end of Office Space when they had the printer out in the field.
That wasn't even the
glad
end.
I
That was the
wasn't
middle.
there.
That was the
Yeah,
best
glad I
Was
part.
that the middle?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it's been a while since I've seen that movie.
Did you ever see the?
we own it if you want to borrow.
Okay.
There was a
Saw you
Funny
just
or Die
called.
remake where they, you know how they did the scene where like, there was the whole thing
They
about
screwed up my phone today.
like the singer,
all
like they
afternoon.
actually reshot that
Trying to
scene with
fit
Michael
the
Jordan, the
time.
singer.
Oh, yeah.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, we own like 4 movies, and that happens.
That's why I'm here.
Totally stole your seat.
How are you? I haven't seen you in a few.
Oh, interesting.
Bad Santa.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, I'm doing
That's
great.
every
Now I'm
year.
trying
I'm at a planning board. I'm at a
have,
planning board meeting. No, there's nothing to report other than us doing snowmaking and welding and running around keeping the place going.
Yeah, you die.
It's a George Harrison
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
concert from the probably like 70s.
That one's
No Repo Man?
That's a good one.
tree bylaws.
You feel old.
You are old.
I know.
And this is Lexington.
Hey, Mike, before I forget,
Uh-oh. What did I do wrong?
no, we have our raffle coming up for work. This is not planning board
John.
related, and you said you'd give us a couple of tickets
Idiocracy?
for that.
Craziness.
Oh, that's a good one
Can I
too.
pick them up sometime this week?
Depression.
Thank you.
Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Oh, it's a classic.
Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
I think I remember that. It was like I don't.
It was when like
see it.
as far as like
How'd you do on Sunday?
yeah. Anyway.
Have any fun?
There's a tree in the front if you took this.
You want to sit here, Mike?
Drove 85. No,
And there's already
R5.
it's just
Really?
nightmare.
Wow. Like, where'd that come from?
If you want, Neil. I don't bite.
R5?
All right.
Well, do you want to sit here in your office?
Even though it's renowned. I mean, it's a French car, but
Mobile office.
yeah.
Being that,
Got a computer.
just
Do you really?
flares are
Yeah, I know.
reminiscent to my childhood.
So I had a friend stayed at my house on New Hebron last week. Did I tell you about the
I didn't realize until after I left that my off-road escapade got me a pedal bike.
out in the front yard?
What's going on?
There was a branch got me on my
Oh,
my
okay.
The dooryard.
escapade to find the corners.
I thought some mosquitoes had like thrown you off into the nether or
I let a
something.
friend stay at the house.
I found that the surveyors had cut a trail out to the lot.
And everyone's texting me like, "Hey, I bet you're gonna run into that bike."
And then somebody took
All right.
Covered it today.
This was kind of
the slide that we had Tuesday.
All right.
Did you look at it?
On the email?
Bouchard, that is, you are more than welcome to join us in our conversation, of course. You will not be seated as a voting member this evening, and probably won't be too many crucial votes to take anyway.
Good.
And so this is a joint meeting with the Housing Committee, the HOP Committee, and so I will call us to order as well. This is a subcommittee of the Planning Board, but I'll call us to order officially. And we have Alexis, Will, and Judy on Zoom this evening. Hello. So our goal for tonight is to consider the draft reports of phases 1 and 2 of the study, as well as start to look forward to phase 3, which would be recommendations. And so that's just to say a few more words about that before passing off. So phase 1 was our housing needs analysis, and we have a wonderful and detailed draft of that report here, and hopefully you've all had a chance to look at it. The Housing Committee has already started going through this, discussing various aspects of it. And when we do come to, in a few minutes, have a discussion of this, I think it would be helpful to keep our, I could say this later as well, but keep our conversation focused really on like identifying the needs that are identified in here and discussing those needs. There's a lot of room for debating the variety of options available to those looking for housing. And we also discussed a little bit some of the temporary workforce issues that we've been having lately with nurses and others who are coming to town. I don't really want to say too much about phase 2 right now. Phase 2 will, I think, be addressed in a presentation we're going to get from Barrett Planning, as well as will serve as a pretty tight segue probably to phase 3 anyway, where we talk about recommendations, because phase 2 will be the barriers. What are the barriers to housing right now? Which is a good, easy segue into talking about recommendations. So with all that being said, let's look back here. I think at this point, it'd probably be a good idea to pass it off to Judy. I think you're muted.
She only caught the tail end of that. We were muted the whole time.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, in the interest of time, I think what I'd like to suggest is if Will can start a slide deck that we have prepared for this evening, and because I want to address a couple of those slides up front, and then turn it over to Will and Alexis to kind of go through that content. But Will, do you have screen share privileges that you can start the slides?
It appears that I do. Give me just 1 second and I will have it up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, we didn't. Oh, we'll do that later. This is later.
Okay.
Slides?
Yeah, you just need to swap the display. You see up top where it says swap display?
Yes. Okay, there we
There you go.
Okay.
Okay, excellent.
So you could just go to the next slide, Will, because this is just the cover slide. So we missed part of the discussion that you had because the audio, I think, was off in your room. But as I think you all know, there are 3 phases to this project. The housing needs assessment and the regulatory audit are substantially complete. We're still editing and still taking comments and trying to address those so that we can park those and say they're done. But we are moving into the regulatory development phase of this, and the whole point of this meeting tonight is for us to be able to kind of explain what the main findings and recommendations are, and to get direction from the planning board, because as I think you all know, we have a deadline to meet later this year in terms of any regulatory development that will be coming out of phase 3. Will, can you go to the next slide? So the direction from the board is really critical for us to be able to proceed. We have a lot of ideas, and we don't expect that the planning board is going to love every one of these. And really, it would be too much to try to do all in 1 year anyway. But we have tried to organize the recommendations into kind of discrete sets of issues that are addressed in the audit, and then try to help connect those observations back to the needs assessment so that there's a clear link for everybody between the needs assessment and what we're going to be talking about this evening. Next slide, Will. So I think at this point, we're going to turn this over to Will and Alexis to kind of go through this. I'm going to ask, because we have so much content to go through, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. We want to be able to address them. But we would be probably in the best interest of the flow of the meeting if you hold your questions until we finish going through these slides, and then we can answer the questions. So if you come up with something and you really want us to discuss it, it's fine. We would just like to hold off until we get to the end of this. So I think with that, Will, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Judy. And just up front, I apologize to everyone. I'm just getting over COVID, so I might sound a little bit hoarse. If I do, I might have to cough. Please just bear with me a little bit, and I apologize in advance. But first, to introduce phase 2, which is the zoning, which is the regulatory audit, we just want to talk a little bit about the basic assumptions in this audit. And the first is, what did we look at? As part of that, we looked at the zoning ordinance, the site plan review regulations, and the subdivision regulations. And so these were the 3 documents we're looking at, and so these are the 3 documents we're going to be talking about. And then in terms of what did we include, the audit presents processes that hinder, discourage, delay, or add additional costs to the development of housing, especially workforce housing in Plymouth. And we want to note immediately up front that the audit is value neutral. And an inclusion in this audit does not necessarily mean it is not advancing an important interest in Plymouth, and does not mean that it should be removed. So if you see things that are in here, we view this as the objective of this was to identify all of the barriers, not just the ones that we thought needed to be getting rid of, so that you as the planning board can understand all of the barriers to help inform which you want to address. And so the organization of the barrier analysis was organized by 5 topics with different subpoints in each. And the first topic was unit density limitations. The second was accessory dwelling unit ordinance. The third was open space residential development, parking requirements, and the final was administrative processes and approvals. So in the report we have very detailed notes on all of these, but to keep things going, to kind of tie us into the next part we're going to, I'll be doing a brief overview of each of the subpoints within these topics, but they are going to be also addressing the regulatory barriers. And so if you have any questions on individual groups of these, please, we do ask you to hold them to the end, but we're happy to talk about any of the questions you have about the actual content of the audit as well. So starting with topic 1, the first barrier we found was regulations that encourage sprawl. And we go into more detail in this in the actual regulatory audit, but there are elements of Plymouth's zoning ordinance especially that encourage sprawl. And when we talk about sprawl, we're meaning unorganized sprawl. We're meaning sprawl that is actually serving to harm Plymouth's infrastructure by overextending it and making it more difficult for Plymouth to support the housing that it is encouraging and supporting what's growing out in those areas. And potential recommendations to address sprawl would mean amending the zoning ordinance to diversify lot sizes, setbacks, and frontages, and to discourage denser development and to encourage denser development in areas that can support it, like the MFR zone and certain parts of the single family and ICD districts. It can also mean adopting new zoning overlay districts to target areas that can support greater density to allow for mixed-use housing development and increased housing diversity, adopting inclusionary zoning ordinance that would allow housing density incentives in exchange for a percentage of units being set aside for workforce housing. It can also mean adopting RSA 79E, either in its community revitalization tax relief district form, in the VC district to support mixed uses in that area, or an RSA 79E housing opportunity zone along either Tenny Mountain Highway or Fairgrounds Road to encourage mixed income housing in those areas.
And so Will, I just want to interject about where some of these things really intersect with the needs assessment. So one thing that we heard kind of walking backwards a little bit in the June community meeting that we had, there was actually quite a bit of willingness in the conversations that we had to explore that first recommendation about diversifying dimensional requirements and things like that by district, saying this might make sense here, but not here. And so, because some of the things are just across the board, and so really kind of understanding that maybe it makes sense to look at ways we can diversify that from one district to the next. And the other thing that I wanted to point out that we're really trying to emphasize here, I know you can't see my mouse, but in the fourth recommendation down where it talks about mixed income housing, that is something that really strongly came out of the needs assessment, and also in the the Lakes Regional Planning Commission's fair share analysis that they did, that it's not just this need for low income housing or even workforce housing. There's also a pretty pronounced need for just more market rate housing that is, you know, just naturally reasonably priced if there's less of a strain on the market. So yes, there is a need for affordability at all levels. So we're not trying to discount the needs of kind of the lower income brackets, but just a recognition that what we found and what the fair share analysis found was that there's really projected need across the board. Back to you, Will.
Thank you, Alexis. And just before I move on to the next barrier, just quickly about the 79E. This is allowed under New Hampshire state law. And what that does is these are certain areas that are geographically designated by the governing body of the town. And within those areas, certain activities, including either rehabilitation or the construction of new housing, depending on the specific form you use, can receive certain tax incentives that would essentially freeze the taxes at their current level for between 5 and 10 years, giving an incentive for developers to come in and do some of that housing where they might not otherwise be able to make a profit in those and generate that housing. Moving into the second barrier under the first topic, we have the limit of 6 units per building. From a general reason, we found in a lot of the interviews that we did that, especially speaking to developers, this was a major limitation on density and incentivizing the development of housing, simply because this was a fairly low number and it made it very hard for developers to pencil out development numbers. Some potential ways to address this include transitioning to a units per acre density calculation instead of limiting density by a uniform number of units in a building, allowing different unit maximums by district in areas like the MFR district, the SFR and CI districts along Highland Street, and some parts of the ICD district along Tenny Mountain Highway, allowing up to 8 or 10 units in that way. And the next barrier is the 2.5 story height limit. This makes it sometimes difficult to get in even the amount of allowed units in a building. And this is especially challenging in areas like the VC, where you have overlapping restrictions such as requiring that residential units can only be on the first or underground floors. So even in those areas where you have looser housing requirements in other ways, this serves to limit the amount of housing that can go in there. And a potential solution to that could involve varying the height maximum by district, with areas like the ICD, HC, and VC districts allowing 3 or 4 story buildings in some cases. The next barrier is the restriction on number of unrelated individuals living in a dwelling. The concern we raise about this is related to essentially federal fair housing. There are certain rules that prevent the discrimination of individuals with disabilities typically living in group homes that right now are not accounted for in the Plymouth zoning ordinance. Essentially right now the rule is that no more than 3 unrelated individuals can live as a household unit in a single apartment in Plymouth. And the concern is that this could prevent forms such as group homes that typically live in that type of situation, but typically exceed more than 3 unrelated individuals in a housing. And so a potential recommendation for that would mean amending the requirement to specifically omit group homes and adding a definition of group homes in the zoning ordinance to better capture and express these groups to ensure that there's compliance with the Fair Housing Act. The next barrier would be lack of provisions for a mix of types of single-family dwelling. In Plymouth's zoning ordinance, there currently is not any allowed attached single-family housing. Things such as townhouses, which vary in noticeable ways from things such as multifamily. And in the community surveys and the public engagement that we were involved in, this came out as a housing type that was desired in the community. And right now there is not a way to meet that demand through the current zoning ordinance. So a potential recommendation to address that barrier would including attached single-family dwellings in the table of uses and developing guidance on the maximum number of units which could be joined for a maximum of either 6 attached structures or perhaps 8 connected units. The next barrier would be minimum lot sizes. Essentially the minimum lot sizes in Plymouth are almost generic across almost every district except for whether or not you are on sewer. This has the effect of encouraging sprawl because they are fairly large minimum lot sizes for a lot of uses, and this encourages when people are looking for development, they tend to focus out further from the downtown core and the village center core where there are services already, but the land for those developments to meet those requirements are more easily found further away again, adding more infrastructure needs to be taken care of, and essentially further spreading out Plymouth and making it more difficult to meet the needs of its citizens. And so a potential recommendation for that would be diversifying minimum lot size by district and reducing minimum lot sizes in the SFR and MFR districts to match existing lot sizes. We call out this specifically because, as the master plan from 2018 says, there are actually almost half of all lots in these districts that do not meet the current minimum lot size. So this essentially locks out from new development or even substantial rehabilitation in some cases a lot of the lots in those most valuable parts of town and those areas where people want to be living. And moving into the next barrier, we have setbacks and frontages. Essentially, many of the setbacks and frontages in Plymouth are very large, and again, they are uniform across the entire town and across every zone, with a couple of exceptions, which again encourages that sprawl as people are drawn to finding lots further away to find lots that meet their requirements. In ways to address this could be diversifying setbacks and frontages by district, reducing them in the SFR, MFR, and CI districts to 20 feet in the front. Additionally, it could mean reducing the minimum lot sizes and allowing frontage and setbacks to match the average of surrounding properties, whichever is smaller. This would allow for the maintenance of community character in these areas, because by allowing the minimum setbacks to be the average of the surrounding areas, you are still allowing for these smaller densities, because in a lot of cases, a lot of development in the SFR and the MFR predates the current zoning. And so by doing this, you are ensuring that you are reducing those to make it easier for development, but you're also ensuring that what you're building is meeting the existing character of the buildings that are already there, and it's not changing things.
Will, just to interject there, again, going back to the needs assessment there, we included a map, I think it was on page 44, of all of those lots, primarily in the downtown area, that are non-conforming, and that map was just based on lot size. It's not even taking into account the other things that we're talking about, like such as setbacks, and instead kind of adjusting that to be, say, for example, the average of what's around it. So this map is just showing lot size alone, what's non-conforming. If we were to map the other things that may make it non-conforming, I'm sure it's quite a bit more.
Thank you, Alexis. And the next barrier I want to talk about is the environmentally sensitive zone. This zone, while it's great that it provides for environmental defense and meets those needs, there are certain aspects of it. The fact that it's just a 500-foot barrier, a 500-foot buffer around the bodies of water targeted, means that there are certain lots that are included on it that do not actually touch any body of water, and this makes it very hard for them to meet some of the minimum requirements established by this zone, such as having, for residential uses, 75 feet per unit of waterfront frontage. It also includes it also makes it much more difficult to build to a density that even is allowed within other parts of Plymouth, and sometimes in the underlying zone that the environmental zone is overlapping, because of the added benefits and because of the added amounts of land it requires. And some potential recommendations to address this without removing the environmentally sensitive zone is to replace the additional water frontage and land area requirements for residential uses with a lower maximum impervious coverage, and adding additional resiliency and stormwater improvements such as bioswales and retention basins, so that you are still maintaining that protection and that flood protection that that zone provides, while allowing some more density in a safe way for the people that are living there and for a safe way for the town. Additionally, you could consider revising the zoning district to only include parcels that are water adjacent, removing the issue of lots that can't meet that requirement. The next barrier is the use of special exceptions. Special exceptions are very heavily used and relied upon in Plymouth zoning code. And while it's important to maintain these levels of oversight, we do hear from developers that when they are looking for development opportunities, the use of special exceptions is concerning to them, because it adds uncertainty, and uncertainty adds development costs, it adds time, and it makes it more difficult for them to produce the housing they're trying to work on. And while we agree that there are some cases that there are special exceptions that are important, there are maybe some ways that Plymouth has gone overboard on them, such as you need a special exception to build a multifamily dwelling in the multifamily district. And so some potential amendments to that could mean allowing multifamily dwellings as a by right use in the multifamily district and within any potential new overlay districts, or considering additional districts where two-family dwellings and manufactured housing could be moved from special exception to by right uses. And then the next barrier is the lack of guidelines for community character. Plymouth zoning does not actually provide any statements of purpose for each of their zones. And while this might seem somewhat trivial, this is actually very important for establishing what needs to be built in these zones and what the town wants, both for you as a board when you are making your decisions to rule whether things are keeping with the community character of the area, and developers to understand what you are looking for, what the community is looking for, what types of housing and development they can build that will meet that community approval because you have it in the zoning ordinance. Additionally, this matters because community character is cited as something that needs to be considered when considering conditional use permits and special exceptions and variances. And without clear guidelines on what needs to be considered when considering community character, and without any statement of purpose to help both the boards that are judging and the developers to understand what they need to meet those requirements, it's providing challenges on both sides. And so some potential recommendations we have for that would mean adopting purpose statements for each district, which outline the character and the types of uses that are permitted here, and also adding additional details within the special exception, variance, and additional use processes, which explicitly outlines what should be considered as part of community and neighborhood character, what should be considered to make both your jobs now and future boards' jobs easier, so it helps them understand, so it helps you understand and kind of lay out in a way that both you, the public, and developers can understand where the goalposts are. And just going forward, when we talk about some of the areas that involve potential areas for increased development, we pulled this map from the 2018 master plan and identify certain areas that are going to be seeing growth. And we just want this map in your minds when you consider, when you are considering where maybe a potential housing overlay zone could go, or maybe if you want to consider adjusting any lines in zoning. This can help you inform where that growth is going to be, so that you can have the zoning meet that growth and encourage it within what works for Plymouth, while also not shutting it out. And so as you can see, as we've already talked about, there's a lot of potential along Fairgrounds Road, sorry, not Fairgrounds, Fairgrounds Road up here, and Tenny Mountain Highway here. And we know there's been talk about development up on Tenny Mountain Road. And so these are just areas we'd like you to keep in consideration when talking about those zoning requirements. And when we talk about housing overlays, and maybe start thinking about areas to direct us to start looking at for those zoning changes. Moving into topic 2, the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. The first barrier we'd like to mention in this is the inclusionist workforce housing. Right at the beginning of this ordinance, it is identified, there's a line that essentially says that all ADUs in Plymouth are workforce housing units. Unfortunately, after reviewing New Hampshire law, this is not correct. There are certain affordability requirements that are an integral part of the workforce housing law in New Hampshire, and you have to meet those, and it explicitly says, even for ADUs, you have to meet those workforce housing affordability levels. And there's nothing in this ordinance that provides those, so it is inaccurate to say that in the zoning ordinance. A potential recommendation for that would be to remove that language entirely, or rephrase it to say that ADUs which meet the requirements outlined in the RSA may count as workforce housing. Additionally, the size and parking requirements, while there are limits to how big the ADUs can be, I believe it's 1,000 square feet, that is interesting. But moving forward, what really we want to draw your attention to is the fact that an ADU requires 2 parking spaces for any ADU, even though you're only allowed to have 2 adults in that ADU by law. This is posing a challenge specifically in the single family, because you are not allowed to put a new curb cut for an ADU, and the ADU will now bring the total number of parking spots in a single family home up to 4, meaning that you are not allowed to have the required number of parking spots in a single family home, because your use chart specifically states that you need to seek a special exception, or not even a special exception in the single family. In the single family, it is forbidden to have either more than 125% of the parking minimum, exactly 125% of the parking minimum, or less than 125% of the parking minimum for parking facilities, which your ordinance describes as 3 or more parking spots. So this is raising an issue within the ADUs, and is by law, unless they seek a variance, preventing ADU development in the single family zone. And so a amendment for that, and we'll talk about addressing the 125% a little bit later, but a immediate recommendation within the ADUs is to reduce the required number of parking spaces to 1 per ADU, which, while you would still have to address the 125%, this does make it a little bit easier to put an ADU in this lot, and it will still make things a little bit easier both for the developers and for the people that are looking to put these ADUs in because of the size requirements. And finally, addressing a misrepresentation in the table of uses. Currently in the table of uses, ADUs are identified as a permitted use. When you actually read the zoning ordinance, it is a conditional use within its section. And this would be a very easy change, but essentially this is just causing confusion on the part of people that are looking to put an ADU in, because they look up front and what is being said in the chart of uses is being contradicted later in the ordinance. So a potential recommendation we have for that would mean amending the table of uses to indicate that an ADU is a conditional use in all districts, not a permitted use, to accurately reflect the requirements. Moving into the next topic, we have the open space residential development. And the first barrier within that section is representation in the table of uses. Again, similar to what we talked about in the ADU ordinance, in the table of uses of the zoning ordinance, the table of uses identifies a cluster development, but that is the only place in the zoning ordinance that the word cluster development appears. And in the actual ordinance, it's called an open space residential development. So we would recommend correcting the table of uses to reflect the correct district name, just to avoid any confusion. Additionally, in setbacks, while the OSRD does provide guidance on things like how far you can reduce the minimum lot size and other things like that, there is no guidance on how to change the minimum setbacks that would be accepted as part of an OSRD. And since you provide guidance in some of the other ways, this is creating a little bit of uncertainty in people that are maybe interested in developing one of these, because they don't know what setbacks the planning board would accept. And so if you provide that up front, that can help speed up the development process, because everyone will be on the same page from the start. And so our guidance would be providing guidance on the minimum setbacks that can be accepted as part of an OSRD, in a similar way that you provide guidance on what the minimum threshold would be for reduced lot sizes. And finally, addressing the open space quality. Essentially, the quality of the open space in these developments is left very much up to the developer and what the planning board likes. And while the planning board, I'm sure, cares very deeply about the quality of these open spaces, this current board might have very different thoughts than what a future board might have. And what that does is that adds uncertainty, and that also means that going forward, there can be differing quality of these developments. And it's always good to have more certainty, especially when it comes to these, so the developer knows and the developer can meet the needs of the community, and so that you can better reflect in your rulings what the community wants and needs. And so we would recommend amending the ordinance to provide stronger guidelines on the quality of the open space that would be accepted as part of an OSRD proposal. And moving into topic 4, we're almost done with this section, I promise. Thank you all for bearing with us. The first we would like to talk about is parking requirements. Essentially, Plymouth has a fairly high parking requirement, especially for some of the multifamily developments. And this can both make it hard to find lots that are available for development, and it also means and it also means that it's much harder to meet the requirements such as impervious coverage in some of these smaller lots. And so a potential recommendation we have for that would mean amending the parking requirements to reduce potential parking requirements in the VC, CI, ICD, and MFR districts for multifamily dwellings where walking is more common and there are public and street parking options available. Additionally, we recommend reducing the minimum parking spot size by 1 foot from 9 foot by 19 to 9 foot by 18. And while we understand that this seems somewhat trivial, this can have fairly significant impacts, especially on bigger developments, because that's per parking lot, you are saving 9 square feet of pavement. That means more open space if you want it that way. That means that there's lower costs in paving because it's dozens of dollars per square foot. You're saving a significant amount of money when paving that, and that can be passed on into the form of housing prices. And it will also allow for more easily to meet the development, to meet some of the other requirements in smaller lots. Next is, as we discussed earlier, the barrier of requiring 125% of the parking minimum. And this is a topic that we saw within the use chart. Essentially, there are 3 rows in the use chart that identify you must seek either a special permit or it is not allowed in either areas, in either parking facilities that allow, you must have in parking facilities, which are, again, 3 or more parking spots by the town's zoning, you must provide 125% of the minimum parking, or you must seek a special exception, and you also cannot provide less than 125% of the minimum parking, or exactly 125% of the minimum parking. This essentially means for any development where you have more than 3 parking units, which is all commercial, all residential, you need a special exception, even if every other part is in compliance. And this adds more steps in the administrative processes, dragging it out, adding more. Again, it's adding more risk into the process because you're never sure if you're going to get a special exception granted. And I understand that with the current board, they do tend to grant these special exceptions within reason. However, you can't say that that will always be the case with every board going forward. And so it's better to not rely on that and to instead let the minimums that you've established speak for themselves. So some potential recommendations for that would mean removing the requirement related to 125% entirely, or amending the definition of a parking facility to be parking for 5 or more vehicles, or exempting parking facilities from the requirements relating to providing 125% of the requirement. So essentially, residential, including multifamily, wouldn't have to meet that extra burden, and this would also remove the complication with the ADUs not being allowed in the single family. The next barrier is clarity on fractional parking. Essentially, because of the way the parking works, there are some instances where you will result in a fraction of parking, a fraction of a parking spot, essentially. And this can cause confusion about whether you need to round up, round down, and we recommend just clarifying for fractional parking requirements if you need to round up, or this also gives the board, if it so chose, the option to provide a little bit of give in the zoning in certain cases by allowing them to round down, essentially saving a single parking spot. Finally, snow storage. Under the current site plan review regulations, you must provide a designated area that is not in the current parking area that is equal to 20% of all of the parking spots, parking lanes, and driveways within the site for the storage of snow. And it also stipulates this cannot be stored on any form of landscaping that could be harmed by snow. And I don't know that many forms of landscaping that aren't harmed by having significant amounts of snow stored on it. And so what this is doing is this encourages developers to pave more area to store their snow in to stow their snow in the winter. And so a potential recommendation around that is removing the designated storage requirement for parking areas of less than 5 total spots. Essentially, for the major developments that come in, this would still require that you have snow storage, but for smaller areas where it might be more of a struggle to meet those requirements, it allows a little bit of flex in there and allows the development in smaller lots that are already existing in Plymouth and right now are struggling under the current regulations. And finally, the final barrier under parking is the encouragement of front parking. And this goes against what is both in the site plan regulations and the master plan, which identifies the desire to encourage all developments to have parking in either the side or the rear. And this is very good, and this is what we as consultants would also recommend. But the issue is that might be the guidance, the design guidelines put forward, but in the actual regulations, you are encouraging parking in the front because you have very wide, very deep front restrictions right now, at 30 feet in those zones. While it's much narrower in the sides and rear, this encourages developers to press their buildings up as close as possible to the side and backs of lots in order to get the most area they can while not seeking a variance or a special exception to put it further in the front. And it's only, in most zones, it's only 15 feet of parking in the side. It's only 15 feet of setback in the front and the rear. This makes it very hard to get any parking structure, any parking in there. And so what you're doing with those setbacks is you are encouraging to put the parking in the front because they have the space for it. And so some recommendations we have for that is reducing the front setback to provide more space within the side and the rear lots for parking, essentially free up some of that back lot so that people feel more comfortable giving up some space back there for their parking spaces. And allowing parking within 5 feet of lot lines in the side and rear, which you already do in some cases in the front, which will again provide more space for people to put cars in the side and the back, meeting the requirements and the guidelines you're already saying in other sections. And the final topic is administrative processes and approvals. The first of these is road requirements. Essentially, through some of the requirements, especially in the site plan review and subdivision regulations, you are encouraging dead-end drives. Specifically, you are encouraging dead-end drives, which make it harder for connectivity in the future. And so, essentially, when you allow dead-end drives and you don't encourage people to put road stubs going out to the edges of their subdivisions, that means the next time someone subdivides, they're going to run another dead end because there's no other way to get to it. If you encourage other forms, then you can allow future connectivity and build in for as Plymouth grows. And so a potential recommendation we have is encouraging through the site plan and subdivision design guidelines the creation of road stubs to property lines to encourage this future connectivity instead of incentivizing more dead end lanes. And the next barrier is lots in multiple districts. In Plymouth, there are a significant number of lots that are split between different zones. And by my count alone, I counted over 75 lots that are split between different zones. And what this does is this artificially locks out some lots from the development potential that you have designated them for. For example, there are a significant number of lots that are split between either the multifamily or the agricultural zones and the single family zone. And typically, this would mean that those lots could be built to the specifications of the multifamily zone or the agricultural zone, which are more permissive than the single family. But the way Plymouth zoning is structured, the lot and any development must abide by the most restrictive guides. And so even when you have just a few feet, which is the case in some of these zones, a few feet of one zone on a lot, that entire lot, and in some cases these are very large lots that could have a lot of potential for development, either commercial but especially for housing near the downtown, these lots are not able to be built on in the most effective way because they have 5 feet in the single family, which severely limits their capacity. And so our potential recommendation for that would be amending the zoning ordinance to reduce or eliminate split lots and have the zoning districts aligned with existing lot lines. Next is the issue of clarity and ease of use in the zoning ordinance. While reviewing it, we found, and we've even today talked about several ways that the zoning ordinance has confusion and maybe some sections that don't agree with each other, and that puts more stress on you as a board trying to rectify these, and it puts more stress on boards going forward. And it leads to confusion from developers, confusion from the public, and slowdowns of processes as people try to work out what the right answer is between contrasting sections. And this is a barrier to development because it makes it harder for people to work with the zoning board. It makes it harder for you guys to do your job, and it makes it harder for Plymouth to see development that potentially wants to come in. And so some potential recommendations we have for that are conducting a complete zoning ordinance audit to address errors, inconsistencies, and readability issues in the current zoning, as well as amending the density tables to have all residential units reported in the same unit of measure and included in the same table. This is not the way it's currently reported. You have single family and two family reported in acres based on per unit count. And then there's a separate table which addresses multifamily, and that is given in square feet, and it's given per lot based on the number of units. So it's reported differently, it's given in different units of measure, and they're in different places. And this makes it harder for people that are trying to understand the requirements in Plymouth to understand what their goals are. And it also makes it harder when you are doing reviews like these to understand how the different types of uses relate to each other. Because when you're going through, you're looking in acres, and then you're looking in square feet, and then you have to convert the square feet to acres. And we had to do this when we were trying to do an audit. In the zoning audit, the first page is an identifier of those differences that we broke into a single unit of measure in that way, and it makes it much easier to compare the densities that Plymouth has based on the amount of development you're seeing. And so finally, our potential recommendation to address clarity and ease of use is simplifying the maximum density to be reported using the same unit of measure and the same calculation for residential uses, whether they're single family or multifamily, to help address that concern. And our final topic is addressing alignment with the RSA. The subdivision and site plan review do not agree on timelines for submissions. And most importantly, the subdivision does not agree with the RSA. And this can cause confusion, as well as it makes it more difficult for people that are applying for both subdivision and site plan review to submit them as a package and follow them through in the same way, because they have different timelines and they're on different schedules. So our potential recommendation for that would mean align the timelines for subdivision site plan review so they both align with the RSA, so that Plymouth's zoning is both in agreement with itself and it's also in agreement with state law. And just as an example for people on the split lot issue, this is a screenshot we took of the zoning and lot from Plymouth's own online GIS tool. And you can see how many split lots there are just in this section. And for people's reference, this pink is the single family. This green color is the CI district with the orangey red as the MFR. And you will see exactly how many lots are split in this way. So all of these lots are locked. These lots are seeing trouble. And all of these lots around here that are large lots close to the downtown are much harder to build on because they fall in the more restrictive single family. And that is our list of recommendations. I believe we were planning on having a quick break in here at this point. Should we do that, or do we want to jump right into the next phase?
I think it would be valuable at this point, since I know the Housing Committee has discussed the housing needs analysis at a couple of meetings now. The Planning Board has not, and I recognize the potential for discussion of the needs analysis, which is very detailed and extensive, to get bogged down. I think it would be still good for the members of the Planning Board to address the needs analysis if you've had a chance to look at it at kind of a flyover level without getting kind of lost in the weeds down below, just to kind of give a general feedback if we have any. And I think more specific responses to the various details you find in each page could go into the CRM that was distributed. That is due, by the way, on Monday, right? Is the date? Monday, to Joseph.
And if I could just request, I know we threw a lot of recommendations at you, but we have a little bit more of structure talking about that later. So we're happy to field questions you have about the recommendations, but we know we just threw a lot of information at you, and we're going to kind of help direct kind of your attention towards some of the ones that we think might be most worth pursuing in kind of the next phase, just so people kind of understand we're not, just dropping all those recommendations on you and then running away.
No, it's a lot to discuss, and guidance at this point is helpful, and it seems like we have a lot of time to discuss all this, but the deadlines are going to creep up on us real fast. But from members of the planning board who haven't really discussed the needs analysis yet, do you have any kind of large takeaways or feedback you want to provide before we jump into the barriers and recommendations? Like, do you have any sense of, we talked about a little bit, like who actually has needs, I'm leaning back, who actually has needs that aren't being met and so forth, or general observations? Yeah, Phil?
I'll share that, on first read through, it seems to be, I don't think there were any glaring surprises. I think it very accurately characterizes the sum of my observations about town and costs, availability, all those things. So I'd like to commend the housing opportunity, or the housing committee for the work they've done.
Thank you.
I thought it was interesting, and maybe I missed it, but we were talking about the types of housing that was needed. I didn't see, or I didn't hear single-family dwellings as a need, and that's just contrary to my experience.
And when you say single-family dwelling, do you mean a detached single-family house, or
Yes.
just like single-family dwellings in general?
Single-family detached house.
Okay.
Yeah. It just seems like there's never a lot of those on the market, at least when I'm looking.
Thank you for that feedback. That is something that the housing committee, actually, we discussed at length on this week, just asking, okay, so whose needs have not been met? Actually, it may have been the previous meeting. I may be getting myself mixed up. But one of the first responses was, people need those kind of starter homes, which, not that everybody wants a single-family detached home. There are plenty of people who want condos or an apartment with less maintenance, but there are also that need that has been, made very inaccessible to families, with lower wage jobs, or even just entering the workforce because of what the price points have turned into. So we do discuss the major increase in prices in the needs assessment, but we could look and see if there's more discussion that we could have on what that in turn has done to the level of need.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that it's necessarily starter homes. I would say I think there's a lack of single-family homes that are available, whether they're starter homes, mid-level homes. I feel, like my personal experience when I was searching for a home, it was very limited selection as to what you could find.
Well, and we often say starter homes, but that would I think some of those same homes could just be homes for not high income, like more middle income families that just are, even if they could find a home, might just be priced out.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I think there's not a lot of homes for middle income families either.
Yeah.
Or even high income families.
Not enough for just about anybody at this point.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's what I'm. Yeah. I guess kind of what I'm getting at is like I think you could throw a lot of groups, or a lot of types of housing in here. I was just surprised that wasn't one of the ones on there.
I think I can help answer that with some of the community engagement meetings we had. Is people that turned out for that weren't the clientele that were looking for that. So that's, I think, that what drove some of this data as well is that, because I feel the same exact way that you do in that boat with single family dwellings, single family homes on their own, detached. But the data wasn't like extrapolated from the people that turned up to the community meetings.
But on the flip side of that, there seems to be demand for a variety, in fact, because there's also not a whole lot of places for aging populations that want to age into this community for them to find non-detached single-family homes that they don't have to take care of anymore.
100%, and that's what sort of drives the results, is because, frankly, from the community engagement we saw, that's who turned out. People that want to sell their single-family homes, want to continue to age in the community, but would rather, and this is, big picture stuff, but rather a 900 square foot condo or, something attached in the community versus that house they've been in for 50 years. But no, I couldn't, agree more with you with that feeling, that sentiment.
I would think that the survey too would have hit a little more of a general population and not just the people that were so motivated to come out to a community event, but I would think that would have hit on some of the needs. I mean, I know my own responses to that were, hitting on the single family detached homes as well.
Yes, that came out fairly strongly in the survey.
Could you, for a quick minute, explain the RSA 79E again? I think that was on.
So this is getting to the recommendations.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. I mean, I just, before we jump into there, I just want to make sure that the planning board has a opportunity to say anything broad they want to say about the needs analysis before we kind of jump into the recommendations and all that. And maybe we're done with that at this point. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to address, I know we had an older population at the second meeting, but we also did a very visual board. I don't know if the planning boards had an opportunity to see that board that we put up there. And also the very positive response for many different dwellings, which sometimes they didn't understand that they were actually multifamily or multi-unit. As long as it was visually appealing, they were very much in favor. And so that was really an eye-opener, I think, for some of us on the housing committee. As you move forward and you start to think about regulatory decision-making, a lot of it, I think, comes back to
it's character more than number of
character,
units at
right.
times, yeah.
And that was very positive, so I don't know if the planning boards had an opportunity to see that.
I think that's going to be part of our discussion going forward, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in the back of our mind,
This
when we
is that
start
big poster with
talking
all the
about
different
it's
houses.
that big picture, yeah.
The house with the overgrown hedges did not get a lot of.
Exactly, no matter what it was. But there were dwellings that most people, when you think of the 6 units, would have said, and they were much larger, it had a very positive appeal to people because it was aesthetically.
Mike?
One thing that the housing committee hasn't talked about at all, and I wanted to mention it at our meeting on Tuesday, was something that was the environmentally sensitive zone and talking about possibly eliminating some of the land that's in it for the river portion. Kind of a background on that, and Neil can back me up on whether this is accurate, which I believe it is. The environmentally sensitive zone was enacted and passed in the town, I think it was in the 90s, prior to the New Hampshire Rivers Protection, whatever that is, which would have been 2000, late 2010s or so. So, in that, the Rivers Act, which is statewide, really took care of a lot of the concerns that the environmentally sensitive zone was trying to take care of. And I think that maybe we're nearing the end of the environmentally sensitive zone because it became extremely ambiguous to what it meant. And it is probably, it hasn't scared away Mike McGinley, but I think there are other developers that maybe wanted to come in that read it and said, yeah, this is, and then they heard about the court case, which you may not be familiar with, Judy and Alexis, but
I don't want to get too deep into this right now, but I was sorry to interrupt, but I was thinking, well, first of all, this is not part of the needs analysis. This is right into the recommendations now, which leads me to think, though, that maybe we're done talking about the needs analysis. If anybody else has any last comments on that.
Can I just ask a question for, it can be for the CRM, but I can't see everybody's wonderful faces very clearly, but whoever made the comment about the single family homes, and I think one thing we would love to hear in the CRM is if there are other things that you think are missing from your experience on the ground in Plymouth, if there are topics that are missing or not touched on enough, we would love to know. And we'd also love to know if anything reads unclearly or charts too confusing or anything like that. That's also the kind of thing that we would love to hear about in the CRM. So if you're still reading it, that's fine, but just, all those comments are very appreciated and will help make the report better in the end.
All right. So I think for discussion-wise, I think we can close talking about the needs analysis for now. And yeah, anything else you come up with, just put it in the CRM for Monday, which is less than a week away. So I know you were just talking about the environmentally sensitive zone, which is one of the issues in the recommendations. And before we go down too deeply into that track, and there definitely will be time to go down there as we move along, I'm curious, Will and Alexis, you said you had a kind of set of places where you might want to kind of jump into the recommendations?
Yeah, so essentially we know we just threw a lot of recommendations at all of you that span a lot of things. And so what we've kind of done is we have pulled what we think are some of the recommendations that will have some significant impacts on alleviating the barriers that we've discussed, both tonight and in the audit. And we kind of grouped them into 3 groupings of essentially ranked by their complexity to enact. And so we'd love to just kind of get into that and kind of help direct people to maybe like looking at a couple of them more clearly. And one of those is the 79E, which I'm happy to go more into detail because I know that's a fairly complex kind of piece of legislation that I'm happy to address. So I will jump us right back in. And now to start and switch displays. And all right, can everyone see my screen all right?
Yeah.
Okay, and sorry, it started from the beginning again. And we will just jump right back in. So moving to the discussion of recommendations. First, we have the low complexity recommendation suggestions. And these are, we recommend removing the incorrect statement about the ADUs counting towards workforce housing, or the rephrasing it, and as well amending the ADU approval process to allow ADUs by right in some cases. Reducing the minimum lot sizes in the SFR and MFR district to match existing lot sizes. Reduce all setbacks in the SFR, MFR, and CI districts to 20 feet in the front and 10 on the side and rear. Also allowing minimum setbacks to match the average setbacks of surrounding properties of similar uses, whichever is less. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. It's a little bit complex, but it, as I said in the original, it essentially allows you to get some extra leeway while maintaining community character. And allowing parking within 5 feet of lot lines on the side and rear to encourage parking in the side and rear of lots. And amending the ordinance to provide stronger guidelines on the quality of open space to be considered in the OSRD. Amending the definition of a parking facility to be parking for 5 or more vehicles, and exempting residential parking facilities from the requirement of providing 125% of the parking requirement. We're recommending that because we know that there were some very significant issues with some commercial developments in the past that led to that consideration about wanting to cap how many there can be for parking spots. And so by exempting the requirement for residential, you're protecting that interest in the commercial while not becoming overly burdensome on other forms of development. And simplifying the maximum density to be reported using the same unit of measure and the same calculation for residential uses, whether they're single family or multifamily, and allowing multifamily dwellings as a by right use in the MFR district and within any new overlay districts. So these are kind of some of the ones we think are there's a low level complexity to getting these passed, and we think these would do a lot of things to address the barriers that we've identified. You've got addressing ADUs and making them more friendly in areas. You have reducing parking requirements to make things easier for parking developments in smaller lots. You are reducing the lot sizes in some of the areas that are most desirable for housing and allowing development back into those areas where your current regulations are shutting it out. And you are also providing some extra guidance on open space, and you're eliminating some of the issues we've highlighted in the use of the zoning ordinance. So we have some more from on here, but these are kind of the first grouping we'd like to kind of direct the board and get some more guidance on how you all feel about these recommendations. and just get some more guidance on what your thoughts of these are and how we can start going forward with these if you think we should be going forward with any of them.
I just want to
Just add.
If I may just add, I think one of the benefits of a bunch of these, from a kind of broader planning perspective, is just that, A, it brings in a whole lot of what's already built out into conformance with the zoning ordinance, and including some really vibrant areas of town. It actually makes it more conforming. And B, it helps us understand, even without the descriptions of our various zones, that our zones are different. Because they, as you mentioned earlier, they look rather similar on paper in terms of dimensional requirements and all that. And this starts to kind of break out different zones as actually doing different things in our zoning ordinance by changing some of those dimensional requirements.
Thank you, John. And I will say also, by even adopting some of these, you are already going to start channeling density into these areas that can better support it and that will allow for density without adding more expenses into the infrastructure system and overtaxing both the tax base and the existing infrastructure, instead of expanding out beyond kind of the existing limits.
So just one thing, just to provide clarity about our timeline. The regulatory amendments that we draft in phase 3 need to be completely wrapped up with a bow by sometime in December. So that, you know, we understand that a lot of what we have thrown at you tonight is going to warrant more discussion. But if there's anything that the board is confident about and comfortable with that we could get started on in the meantime, that would be fantastic, so that we're not halting phase 3. And so, like Will said, we took all those recommendations, which were organized by topic, and we tried to organize them into low complexity, moderate complexity, and, you know, higher levels of complexity. If we could even get some guidance tonight on just these low complexity recommendations, that's what we would love to come away from. I mean, if we get through these and there's others that you want to discuss and we have time, that's fine. But these are the ones that if we can walk away with some guidance on, we can internally start moving forward on the next steps. And then, Judy, I see you unmuted yourself. I have one quick question for Will first. For amending the ADU process to allow ADUs by right, Will, correct me if I'm wrong, is that also including just changing the process of approval so it is a staff level thing versus board level?
When you allow some, well, my understanding is with the way it works within Plymouth is when you allow it by right, it becomes more staff level focused than needing to go before the planning board.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you.
So the only comment I wanted to make is that I think we know as a team that low complexity doesn't necessarily mean politically expedient. Low complexity means these are not challenging recommendations for us to prepare, to draft. It's these are things that we could do pretty quickly in most cases. Whether they are easy to sell is really, I think, where your expertise comes in as a board and as a housing committee. But these are things that we know we can do fairly quickly.
Yeah. So, I mean, my own personal take, I mean, just to run through some of this, reducing minimum lot sizes, absolutely, we have to decide what they are, of course. I'm wondering about the setback of 20 feet in the front. When we looked at this about a year or so ago, we actually made by special exception, it was just 30 before, and we made 15 by special exception, and we even considered whether or not to make that by right, and we didn't. And we came up with the number 15, which is a little bit even smaller yet.
But our discussion concluded in saying, let's wait till we have the results of the housing study
There's
before
that.
we move forward.
And
So-
this is saying 20.
Okay.
But
Let's
I also
go forward.
I wonder when we say allow parking within 5 feet, which I really like, of the lot line and the sides and rear, does that include parking structures like a garage? I would say yes, as long as it doesn't serve another function like maybe an ADU as well.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly could include parking structures. I just would want to make sure that you don't have parking garages forward from the front building line of the dwelling.
Yeah.
There's one being built right now on Pleasant Street with an accessory dwelling unit above it that's well within 5 feet of the lot line.
Is it within? I don't. No.
The-
I believe it meets the setbacks.
Let me say this, where they're currently clearing the property and putting the fill, it is looking as though it is going to be sit within 5 feet.
I think that's not what we saw.
The plans that we got
It'll
suggested
show,
otherwise. Yeah.
but the concept of being able to have an accessory dwelling unit with a garage behind a unit, precedent was set, was it not?
Well, the question is, if we actually if we make a 5-foot setback for parking, then would we also allow an accessory dwelling unit within that? I would not want to, personally.
Or do we even allow a garage to be that close?
I
You
mean,
know,
we do, I mean, we've got a whole bunch that are on the property line at this point, and that might be a problem, but I mean, wonder if 5 feet's okay
I have 5 garages in my own company that are literally sitting
on the property.
on property lines.
I've got.
Yeah, I have a
Yeah.
garage on the property line as well.
And it's part of the character of our community, and right now, it was at one point what was done. Now we're questioning about creating more density. That may be something that should be discussed at some point.
Well, currently, you're not allowed to go, you're not allowed to do that currently. It's already, you know, an existing use. So we're talking about making it easier to do something that gets closer to that.
In the future.
Is
Yeah.
the presence of I mean, is the garage a barrier, you know, I mean, parking is a barrier, but is the garage, when we're talking barriers here, I don't get the sense that we're talking about indoor parking.
Well,
that's
no, but a lot of
creating an
people,
issue.
want a garage,
Mhm.
and when you're working on a small lot, and you prefer the garage to be in the back rather than in front of the house, it starts to become really difficult to squeeze it on there.
I know someone right now that lives on High Street that wants to do just that. Build a garage behind his house, and it might, you know, adjusting those lines will make a big impact on them trying to be able to do that.
I think this just speaks to sort of, maybe this is an increasingly complex recommendation, just trying to make sure we're working out this as an issue, because to me, a garage, I mean, I do have a garage that's on a property line, but in the single-family residential, when we do have non-complying lots, you know, maybe that's a different consideration. Maybe we need to think about what's existing in other areas. It's not just in the single-family and the multifamily residential area where might be something that's considered. But, you know, if you've got something in the ag zone and you've got a garage that's 5 feet from the property line, to me, that's a very different thing than in the single-family residential, so.
I will say this again kind of speaks to what we identified about needing diversity within the different zones. So what works for the SFR, the MFR, probably won't work for the ag zone or other zones like that, and that's something that we can build into any changes that we propose, and would also help speak towards that when we've talked about that, you know, the character of the different zones. So, you know, if we get guidance from the planning board that you want certain things to change in different zones and reflect in different zones, we can absolutely do that.
So I wonder if we just like start going down this list here and seeing the stuff that you should start working on, like just. Like,
Please.
That would be a big help.
Yeah. Remove incorrect statements about ADUs counting towards workforce housing. Anybody like not okay with that?
I'm good with that.
I'm not sure exactly what the change is doing.
They're not. Right now, our ordinance says that if you create an ADU, you're contributing to workforce housing, regardless of the cost, just by creating one. And many do contribute to workforce housing, but it's not true that all are automatically so.
Okay, all right.
That's, I mean, we're basically
Correcting an error.
contradicting the RSA on
Yeah.
workforce housing and the definition of affordability by stating that.
Many of them will naturally do so, but
Right.
they don't necessarily.
Right.
So that makes sense. Reduce minimum lot sizes for single-family and multifamily districts to match existing lot sizes.
John, can you actually go back to the ADU one, because there
Oh,
was
yeah.
the second half of that, amending the
Right.
process.
Sorry, space did not become our friend on this slide, so a couple of things got
Right.
smushed together.
ADUs by right or by still by special
We've
exception
talked,
by
oh, no,
conditional use?
we've talked, well, I've mentioned it in every meeting, we've had this, ADU application. I think that judging by the number of applications we get, we can't manage the CUPs for the ADUs, as a board, just
And we
in
never had
meeting time.
we never had a vote, but there seems to be some broad consensus that it would be a good idea.
Yeah, they just go to the planner and get their building permit, get it approved, and they're done.
Would that be the conditional use aspect that the planner would?
No, the conditional uses, they come to us.
We have to approve the conditional use.
So what threw me off is on the slide that we saw earlier during it, it suggested that we go to conditional use.
It just wasn't, the ordinance itself, according to that side, was contradicting itself. It says by right in one place and conditionally used in
Oh,
another
just
place.
about the contradiction. Okay, all
Trying to
right.
get rid of the contract.
I would support going to ADUs by right.
Yep, I do too.
My only question is, and I think the answer is probably no, is there any particular circumstance where that would become a problem that we have to address? I don't think so. But I think by right makes sense, and I think a lot of other communities are doing it by right. So perhaps if we just look at their language, maybe, just to make sure that we cover our bases, you know.
And what I can also say about that is if there are any issues, something's not in compliance, it would get bounced back to you anyway. So as long as you all are confident in the regulations you have for them right now and the rules about them, it's not going to have any real change. It's just you guys are no longer a step on the process.
And bogged down in our agendas.
Well,
Exactly.
If it didn't qualify through the regulations, they couldn't get a building permit.
Yeah.
Correct.
It wouldn't come
And they would
back
have
to
to
us.
seek variances and stuff, or a special exception.
Okay,
So it would go back before the boards.
yep.
And probably the zoning board at that point, yeah. Yeah, so that all sounds something to start working on. So lot sizes, reduce minimum lot sizes. I mean, two existing lot sizes, which can be open to interpretation, but certainly to be in more conformance with what we do have as existing lot sizes. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I do.
Yeah?
So I think I read it in the draft report. I think that's where I saw this, that making sure we're dealing with this by neighborhood. The single-family residential zone is fairly large and pretty diverse in its density as it exists now. And so making sure that we're not allowing for something that would be okay in the more densely developed single-family residential that might be just not within the character of the neighborhood, say up on Thurlow Street or something like that.
Right, so how would that look like by abutters? Like only the abutting lots would be
I was just
averaged,
thinking that.
maybe?
It's the
you could say
average, yeah.
The mean of the abutting lots.
Yeah.
right?
Because then it could get quite extravagant just 2 blocks down, you know, non-abutters.
I mean,
Right.
personally, I also wonder, though, if we're trying to prevent disorganized sprawl, if encouraging infill in the single-family residential, even where it is a little bit more open right now, is not a bad idea,
So I guess I think,
especially where there's already services to, you know, take that.
so in our neighborhood in Wentworth Street, I mean, our lots are like 0.2 acres. They're small. And then you've got lot sizes up in Thurlow Street that are 3 acres. And I think I think the character of those neighborhoods are vastly different. And the reason why people are in those neighborhoods can be very different. So if all of a sudden you could take what was a 3 acre lot and turn it into, 0.2 acre, I mean, it's not served by sewer, so that's a different issue. But
15 potential lots.
But I mean, that changes the character of the neighborhood, and it changes what is drawing people to those specific places. So I just think it's, I think I'm all for discouraging sprawl, but doing it in a way that's consistent with what's existing and what's drawing people to, certain places. So.
If I may, it could be as simple as addressing it based on whether or not you're on sewer. That's not the entire proportion, but that could be a way to address your concern about, still allowing for development in some of those denser areas that are on sewer and can support that, while areas that are slightly further off will maintain slightly larger lots because, and still maintain some of that character.
I think the availability of sewer is a prerequisite for reducing lot sizes, but I do think there's still some variability. I like the idea of kind of looking at it neighborhood by neighborhood on a more local scale to allow for some infill development that's still within the character of the neighborhood. I do think there's potential for infill development. So I actually had a friend recently purchased a lot next door which had a house that burned down, and they were considering merging the lots, and I said, think twice before you do that, because that is currently a non-conforming lot. If you merge it, you will never be able to subdivide it again under current zoning. You know, and that's something they hadn't considered, but, you know, there are a lot of lots downtown that are existing that you could never be created today under a current zoning. But they're still very nice, desirable residential lots, and I think we're missing something with our existing minimum lot sizes.
Yeah. And then you have, I mean, down the road, I know, and I discussed this in the meeting the other day, more and more students are gonna be living on campus. The university's shrinking. We all know this. It's not something that's new news. As more and more off-campus properties, such as the ones that I manage, let's say they sell off, someone comes in. I have some fairly large pieces of property that are unique in their shape and how close the things are. You know, you want to make sure that if someone ever purchased 25 Russell and wants to put 2 houses there, that they could live inside the town ordinance. You want to make sure that there's an opportunity that, you know, because most people aren't going to buy a 200-year-old, you know, farmhouse and spend the $500,000 it's going to cost to refurb it. If they were ever to buy it, they may want to take it down. And it's a very large lot on Russell Street that is very different than 23 Russell, which is, you know, the house sits on its property line on one side and sits on its property line on the other side.
So just to clarify then, your position on this is that yes, smaller lot sizes would be a good idea?
I believe it should be, yeah. Small, but much like Phil said, you know, contingent upon, was it Matt that even said it, that look at the houses that are around it. You know, there's a big difference between Wentworth Street and Russell and High, and you know, they're all so unique, and some of these houses have been there for years.
I'm looking down Pleasant Street. Most of the lots are like, you know, a third or 0.3, 0.4. You know,
yeah,
like certainly under a half acre, and we've slipped. Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is there could be potential redevelopment in these areas,
yes.
judging by the trends. Yeah.
We don't want to make sure we're not hamstringing ourselves now, when if we want density, and you tear down a 7,000 square foot Victorian mansion, you might find 1 or 2 houses that could fit with inside, you know, our zoning structures that would increase that density, meet the character of the community of what it was, you know, 50 to 100 years ago. If you look at any map of Plymouth from the 1800s, far different than it is right now. It was far more dense. And a lot of those we let go because we wanted to not live on top of each other. Some of it was safety, you know, fire concerns. But, you know, as we're trying to think about this higher density in a community like this, you know, we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful for the future when changing these lot size minimums and how close they can be. And, you know, someone's going to say, I don't want anything right on my property line, but yet, like you said, you literally have a garage on the property line and you love your house. Or you love, you know, your neighbors literally bought in a community. They're like, oh, that's kind of cute. We all like that. We don't know what that is. We just need to make sure that we package it in a way that everybody gets a chance to look at it. Because we're going to sell this to the community.
So it sounds like both the minimum lot sizes and the setbacks is something that is worth exploring.
It's definitely worth exploring. I mean, from your guys' our planning's perspective, I don't think we're going to reach a consensus tonight, but it's definitely, it seems like we're all on board with, in some way, making some kind of amendment here. What exactly that looks like, I doubt we're going to come to a consensus tonight, but.
I mean, this is not the adoption process, right? We can ask them to work on something for us to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're looking for guidance.
Yeah.
I think there's very little opposition to doing that.
Yeah.
And it's not something that's gonna happen tonight. I mean, over a period of a couple of years, it's very long-term that we'll see the results.
I think we should make quick decisions on these and try to
Yeah.
get through this list.
So allow
I
parking.
like this discussion, but.
Allow parking within 5 feet of lot lines in the side and rear to encourage parking in the side and rear.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Try it.
See what it looks like. Amend the ordinance to provide stronger guidelines on the quality of open space to be part of the OSRD. Open space residential development, yeah?
Yep.
Okay.
I like this a lot.
Yeah.
Amend the definition of a parking facility to be parking for 5 or more vehicles and exempt residential parking facilities from the requirement to provide 125% of the parking requirement.
Yes.
Yeah?
Honestly, I
Good.
find this stuff so confusing, and
Yeah, I
I guess
agree.
that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
It is part of the problem.
That was put in place to stop the parking issues on college residents.
Yeah.
where they just,
How is that gonna help, though? I'm trying to understand that.
Currently, anything above 3 is a parking facility, which has its own sets of issues and hurdles, and so you can have like it.
I'm in violation right now. Definitely in violation.
I'm not
I think the biggest thing on that one is that it was, you couldn't be more than this, but you couldn't be less than this, but if you're less than this and more than that, then you're, like, it just,
Make it simple.
make it simple.
Simplify maximum density to be reported using the same unit of measure, like absolutely. And the same calculation for
Living units,
residential
right.
uses, whether they are single family or multifamily.
Yes.
I'm good with that. Okay. Allow multifamily dwellings as a by right use in the, get this, the multifamily residential district.
I don't know about that.
So
And within any new overlay districts, which is a slightly more complicated part that we'll have to get to a little bit later, the overlay districts.
Potentially.
yeah,
I think we should look at it.
Yeah, I think this is great. I do think when we look at the names of zones, the name does not imply. I mean, the name often can imply use, but it doesn't. I think the best example in my mind is the ag zone. That there is agriculture, but we're not really doing much in the zoning ordinance to protect agriculture. So, but lining this up makes sense to me.
I'll start.
No, I'm done. Period.
All right, so that's the low complexity, and I think we've gotten through all of them. The only one I think there's still like room for discussion, although we're on board in theory at least, is the actual size of the setbacks and lot sizes and stuff.
Okay.
Of course, and I do just want to say, John, to address your point, if we put 20 feet because that's a little bit more common in what we've seen in other areas, but if you all believe that less than that 15 foot is more fitting for Plymouth, we're absolutely happy to do that. We're happy to take the actual numbers from you all as well.
Well, and then there's
So-
also, you mentioned actually like looking at the setbacks of your neighboring properties. Because there are places in single-family residential where you'll find like 10 or 12, in fact.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it would make sense in some of those places to build at the same.
Well, the average setback, of lots on either side is
Yeah.
another way to do this. So you
Yeah,
could say 15 feet or the average, whichever is less.
Yeah,
right. So there's kind of two recommendations there. Kind of yeah.
yeah.
So I know the board needs more time to think about what the numbers would be,
Like the
but
concept.
but looking separately at the idea of averaging setbacks, what about that, John?
That's pretty standard
post it to the board.
Consensus on that, or?
Well, I think that helps you to conform in the different neighborhoods like we were all concerned with.
Yes, it does.
Yep.
It gives you,
It's a character tool.
right, exactly, exactly.
One of the reasons, though, when we were talking about the 15 feet by special exception, and to allow that everywhere in a single-family residential, was that there are cases on steep slopes and other areas that are less densely populated and where the typical setbacks are greater, where you actually might want to go to 15 just to be able to build well on your property because of a steep slope or something like that, or some other feature of the landscape that might make it a barrier to build at 30, let's say, even though your neighbors are. That was part of our discussion last year when we were talking about this. So there's some issues to work out there, but I think we're, at least in a broad way, kind of on board.
All right. Well, that's fantastic, and we made that through in record time. Thank you all
Yeah,
very
that's
much.
great.
I really
We
appreciate
have a
it.
lot we can get started on.
Yeah, and to make more work for ourselves, should we jump into the moderate complexity?
That first one's it's a simple issue, but
Yeah, and so for these, we've got, as we said, these are, and again, this is when we're talking about complexity, we're talking about from our standpoint, not necessarily a political standpoint. So the first of these is conduct a complete zoning ordinance audit to address errors, inconsistencies, and readability issues. What this could mean is essentially hiring someone from the outside or having the planning department essentially do a full read through and just address all of these inconsistencies, both the ones that we've highlighted here and some others that come up, just to make the overall document more accessible to the public. And then the next recommendation would be amending the density table to have all residential uses reported in the same unit of measure and included in the same table. That addresses the point we had before. It's again, for the point of repetition, the same unit of measure, but this one would change the actual format of the chart so that all the residential uses are on one chart instead of, depending on your use, having to go to a different form. Including attached single-family dwellings on the table of uses, and developing guidance on the maximum number of units which can be joined for a maximum of either 6 attached structures or 8. This would allow kind of some more forms of housing in Plymouth to come about, and this actually meets, as we've said a little bit earlier in the survey, there was demand for townhouses and similar structures like that, and this would meet that need that the zoning isn't right now allowing to be provided, or it has to be kind of jammed in under a multifamily, which it isn't really that. This could be different. And then amend the zoning ordinance to diversify lot sizes, setbacks, and frontages, and to encourage denser development in areas that can support it, like the MFR district and certain parts of the SFR and ICD. And I know some of the lot diversity size we talked about in the first round, but this is more looking at all of the zones instead of limiting to the SFR and the MFR.
I like all of these.
So when are we doing our complete zoning ordinance audits? You guys busy? No.
I think that's largely a budget issue.
No, I mean,
We need the money to be able
I
to
will
do
just say
that.
from our end, we've been trying over the years to attack a lot of these issues, and it's a piecemeal process just because of our own capacity in terms of our own planners and the board, and it's a lot of work. And I think this would require to do it in a more meaningful way to hire someone on the outside, and that then becomes a budget issue, which we could talk about going forward. But
Maybe our updated zoning ordinances will generate so much tax revenue from the ag development that we'll be able to do a zoning ordinance audit.
What's the difference between attached structures versus connected units?
That was my question too.
Single family attached versus multifamily. Is that
So,
So single family attached, like a townhouse, Judy, you're great at describing this. They have their own entryway, right? That's,
entry at grade,
yep.
that's the key. Whereas multifamily may be a townhouse type structure, but may also be the type of building where the units are stacked and entrance to a unit is from inside.
So
So
connected
they're different forms.
And also in a townhouse, everyone kind of has their own yard. Whereas if you're in a stacked flat situation,
So a connected unit could be a multifamily where you go in one door and then you can access your apartment or home, whereas an attached structure, you walk in from the outside into your unit. Is that what?
That is correct, that's
in a
right.
multifamily, you have a shared outdoor space, and the
Yeah,
attached, you have your own outdoor space.
right.
to an extent?
so one thing I just want to comment on with the zoning ordinance audit, that, we've talked about how anything that, any amendment that would go to town meeting, well, we can't do a full zoning ordinance audit and correct everything. If there's something like, say if we're doing an ADU ordinance amendment, as part of that, we can look and point out all of the places where things need to be changed. So even though you're not getting a full audit out of this, and it is going to self-correct a lot of the inconsistencies and issues. And, you know, I think we'll be also, I mean, some of the things like when it's inconsistent with, say, your site plan regs
Yeah.
or your subdivision rules and regs, I mean, that's something that you as a board can just go among, you know, yourselves to amend if we have pointed out, you know, that there's inconsistency somewhere.
I mean, if we see something that's obvious next to a section we're working on, you know, just ethically, I can't, I'm gonna leave it alone. We just can't fix all the stuff in the ordinance that's messed up, but, I mean, if we see something, it's kind of like if you see something, say something. So if we see something, we'll say something and we'll do something.
So the number of 8 versus 6 is kind of something in the survey that was filled out, and most people, the most important thing was not changing it. The second most thing was keeping it less than 6 and not changing it to more than 6. So it might be a really hard sell for us to try and go down that path to look at more than 6.
If I can address that also, though, I would also say, as another part of our outreach, when we had the second community meeting, when we put all those different pictures up.
But those weren't, I'll stop you right there. The whole concept of that
No.
was to know what they liked as a look.
And
It
here's-
wasn't about
and-
whether they liked it
Can I
as
tell
an
you
address.
something, because I was at that station
Yeah.
to correct that? We had discussion with each person that stepped in front and talked about the increase in the number of units, how it was more than 6. So when people put their little dot up there, they understood it was 10, 15. I just want you, there was conversation, it wasn't just a flat board.
I think there's a lot of preconception when you say, like, 12 units. You get a mental conception of what that means. And I think part of that exercise was to realize there's a lot of different ways to accomplish this.
Exactly.
And this is where I personally think some kind of, and we've talked about this a little bit, like design guidelines or
Yes.
structure types as part of our definitions might go a long way to alleviating some of these concerns. If we had something in our ordinance that could give guidance to developers that we don't want it to look like this, but we're more comfortable with it looking like this.
And I also, and I've been saying this in the beginning, not looking to help them out too much, but I think there's a space within inside the town that is definitely something that we should be considering. You know, we have Tenny Mountain that can have its own zone that you can do all of those things in terms of increased dwelling, more people, building more efficiently, etc. My concern is in Plymouth, downtown, whether it be behind Patty's store or on Russell Street, we've been very specific over time to limit the amount of people within inside or apartments within inside a structure that would radically change our downtown. And I can't say anything. I literally work for a company that has multiple, I have 26 buildings, and of those 26 buildings, I think 12 of which have at least 6
Well,
apartments in
when
it.
you say radically change our downtown, though, we're also talking about a downtown, as you mentioned earlier, was much denser historically than it is currently.
Yep.
You
That
have
was also in a time when they didn't have vehicles. So,
And the density was around the train station.
and the density was around the train station. There's a difference between adding, 25 apartments, which could definitely fit in the building that Alex bought, because my company looked to buy it. You could fit 25 apartments in there. But where are we gonna put the cars? So, at a place like Tenny Mountain, where you can build condos and you can build 4-story structures that are appealing to the eye, fill lots of needs, it's totally different for that to be a selling point to the townspeople than say, hey, we need 10 apartments within inside a structure, no matter what the structure looks like. you still then need parking for 10 apartments in a building in the town, in downtown, which, you know, if that's the case, I got plenty of space on my Winter Street apartment to do right behind your house. And I'm sure that would change the look of downtown.
Rebecca?
So I think.
This could be another example of where it is appropriate to look at varying this by district.
Yes.
Yes.
That's what I was gonna say, that it sounds like there, and I actually, I don't know if have we seen the results of the survey?
Yes.
Well, you might have, yeah.
I don't think directly, no. I
Okay.
mean, I think you've seen some of the compilation of those results,
Okay.
but not the direct results.
Double-sided.
Okay. So I guess I'm just curious to hear from the folks at Barrett about I mean, then this doesn't have to be something that we talk about tonight, because we could be here all night, but, or at least until our 10 p.m. limit. Is just curious about the response in the survey to greater than 6 units. And also I just.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, Mike is correct that it was the least favored type. And I guess what I would say to that is, if it's a decision to explore further, then you have education to do, because
Right.
then when there's ways that you can show people what 10 units could look like, or where it might be more appropriate in town. So I think the way we also look at a survey for community engagement, it's not like a vote. It is also just giving us a sense of where is the community right now before any sort of outreach or education has happened about this. So yes, Mike is correct that the greater than 6 units, not a very popular choice. It wasn't asking about different locations and things like that, or the survey results. I mean, I can follow up with John about getting them to you. I know they are also on the housing project page.
So actually, can I ask a clarifying question here? At some other point in the recommendations, you suggest moving away from units per building and
Yep.
moving towards units per acre.
Right.
If you can clarify that, and which is preferable, or if one is preferable in certain circumstances, one in the other, or.
So I guess, is the question that if you're doing the units per acre, is it even really necessary? Like, are you just removing the units per building then?
That's what
Is
I'm
that-
wondering, yeah.
I mean,
Well, probably not, because if someone is doing a multifamily development, you do want to think about the scale of the buildings.
Yeah.
If someone has more of an acre, I mean, it's not uncommon at all in multifamily zoning to say, 5,000 square feet per unit and no more than X number of units in a building.
Mm-hmm.
That's just very common. So I wouldn't be concerned about saying that at all.
I guess I wonder how that dovetails then with the units per acre, and as long as you meet both, I guess you're fine.
Yeah, that's what any multifamily developer would expect to do. I've got these things I have to do. I can't have a building that's bigger than X, and the maximum number of units I can get on my site is the acreage divided by the lot area per unit minus, access road, parking, and everything else. And I think one of the things I would say that people need to keep in mind is, just because you liberate in your zoning opportunities that don't exist today, it doesn't mean that they are going to pop up all over the place, because not every site works for every type of project. And I just think that's important to bear in mind. You're trying to create opportunity that doesn't exist today, but don't get carried away here and think that somehow that is just going to overnight happen everywhere. It just doesn't work that way.
Thank you.
And certainly you must know that as planning board members, that just because you have something in your zoning, it doesn't mean it happens everywhere.
Although I have to say, the ADUs pop all of a sudden, they started popping up all over the
Well,
place.
Yeah.
But it took a while.
It did take a while.
Patty?
Wasn't overnight.
Can I just ask a quick question? When was that 6-unit passed, and is there direct correlation to the increase in the size of the university, and now we're decreasing that size and we need different types of housings? Do we know what year that was passed, approximately?
It's been as far back, at least since the 80s, it's been in place. It may have been
before that, but as far back as.
Yeah, I don't think it was
off the top of
before
my
the
head.
80s, but
was
I think
before
there's a
Fox
direct correlation in regard to the size of the university increasing. And-
All of our zoning that we're talking about right now is in direct correlation to university and university housing. It was cars, number of people,
Fox
number
Park
of,
was before.
they were trying to zone their
Yeah, Fox
way
Park
out
was
of
there when we came to Plymouth State,
homes
I think.
going from
Yeah.
single family to
70.
multifamily.
It's the loss of, single-family
Yeah,
homes
it
and
was the
changing the
loss.
character of neighborhoods and
Yeah.
and things like that.
And so
yeah.
all of those were things that were put in place at some point.
As a result of the oil embargo.
Yeah.
I
That's
seem,
the history of
I
it.
seem to recall when we discussed 6 units per building with the zoning board, one of the members of the ZBA mentioned that, there's kind of one development where a variance was issued and,
Fox Park.
Fox Park.
and it was,
Fox Park was
he-
here in
he-
the
but
70s when I came to school.
his personal opinion was that it was a regretful decision,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I would just say design matters almost more than
Sure,
anything.
sure.
And so, frankly, pardon my language, but a crappy looking multifamily building could be 4 units, it could be 12, it could be whatever. A lovely multifamily building could be 12, it could be 18. But the siting of the building, its orientation in relation to the street and other structures around it, your landscaping, your lighting, all those kind of site treatments that you do to make a place a lovely environment for someone to live, also creates a lovely environment for the neighborhood.
Yep.
But if people don't see that in their community now, what they imagine is the worst, and that's going to generate a certain response. You can lead a discussion as a planning board toward understanding quality development. That really is not just about quantity, it's about character. It's about how do you build character into projects. And suddenly, when you do that, as we saw at the station at that second community meeting, when people can see what site treatments can do to make a very attractive place to live, number of units doesn't matter as much. But your town doesn't know that because you don't have zoning that does that.
So, I'm facilitating, but it's not my job.
No, I mean, I was actually going to go a completely different direction, but if you have a comment or question you want to make.
I was just gonna say, I mean, is the group amenable to looking into this further? It sounds like, from what Bruce said, that maybe there might be areas in town where we would consider looking at unit sizes that are greater than 6.
I think looking at areas, I think that's a good.
So I think so. Where this conversation actually, where I was wanting to go, sparked was the attached single-family dwellings, and the number 8 is here, and all of a sudden we started going over there. And if we can maybe for a moment actually go back to our list that we were working on, and I imagine the broader number of units question is probably going to come up again, probably at a more higher complexity or something. So we were looking through this list. Amend the density tables to have all residential, I guess we agreed on that. Include include attached single-family dwellings in the table of uses.
Differentiate from multifamily.
Differentiate from multifamily and detached single-family, yeah.
Which we have many examples of. I mean, most of the homes up at Tenny Mountain are attached single family. The Blueberry
Yes.
Hill condos are attached single family. Like,
Yep.
they're all over. It's just that we just call them multifamily.
So it seems like a good idea. Yeah.
Again, a good idea for,
For townhouse-style development, for example, to have
Good
attached
to address it
single-family
specifically
dwellings.
as an accepted use in the table of uses.
Yeah, okay. And then we can talk about where they actually go into which zones,
Right.
but just to include it at all.
well, I know
Yeah, I
that
mean-
going more than 6 units would be very tough in this town, from the feedback that I've.
But this is,
Yeah,
this
that's
is,
what
a-
we're talking
this
about,
is, this is,
That's-
this
yeah.
is a different.
I know. And as far as a location, I love the idea of looking at Tenny Mountain and the recreational use and.
I love the idea of looking at it in walkable neighborhoods as well.
Right.
For people aging in the community, for example, these might be really attractive, do not have a yard to take care of and all that, have a ownable, single-family dwelling attached in a walkable neighborhood to their services and go
Without
shopping or
exterior
whatever.
maintenance.
Yeah. So I think
Looks like me.
Single entrance at grade.
But what we're talking about is the table of uses right now,
Yeah,
right?
we are.
So we're actually
Right.
adding something that exists into the table of uses, so then we can.
Yes, yes.
we can-
Specifically,
So then
Better
we can,
regulate
then we
where.
can, yeah, we can decide where it's going.
So yes.
So what you need in your zoning ordinance is a definition for attached single family that clearly helps to differentiate it from multifamily, because those are different building forms.
Yep.
And you might want to allow some in one location and not others. So that's kind of assumed on our part, that if we're going to add this to the table of uses, we also have to look at the definitions.
Yep. Absolutely.
And then the conversation about, like Judy said, where that's allowed, what it looks like, that's another conversation, but just distinguishing attached single family from multifamily, which you don't do right now, gives you more flexibility in that
Right.
regard.
For example, I can't imagine anybody building a new multifamily residential in town, but I can imagine a lot of people building attached single family. But, you know, I think most of our multifamily falls into the existing homes that are converted from giant Victorians that are a single entrance with an apartment here, apartment there.
All right. So amend zoning ordinance to diversify lot sizes, setbacks, and frontages, and to encourage denser development in areas that support it, like the multifamily residential and certain parts of SFR and ICD. And I think this is kind of piggybacking on the last discussion we had, and it seems like we're on board with that, I think, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so we're through the moderate ones.
All right.
Can't wait to see the extreme.
Extreme, they're called higher.
Right, wow.
Extreme.
Are you guys ready for the hard ones now?
So Will, just to clarify, there are recommendations that are not listed here, period, right?
Yes.
Like we just
Right.
picked
Yeah, yeah,
a
we,
few to focus on right now and organize them this way,
This is our
so.
first dive, and we're going
Yeah.
well, yeah.
Yeah.
yes. And, yeah, here we go. And this one has a 79E, so once we hit that one, I'll kind of give a refresher on what that program is, because I know there was a question about it a little bit earlier. So first under here, we have amend the zoning ordinance to reduce or eliminate split lots and have zoning districts align with lot lines. I told you this would be a harder one. Adopt new zoning overlay districts in targeted areas that can support greater density to allow for mixed-use housing development and increased housing diversity. Consider additional districts where two-family dwellings and manufactured housing could be moved from special exception to by right use. Adopt an RSA 79E community revitalization tax relief district in the VC district to support mixed uses, and an RSA 79E housing opportunity zone along either Tenny Mountain Highway or Fairgrounds Road to encourage mixed income housing in those areas. And finally, consider the implementation of improved design guidelines for the OSRD and higher density residential developments. And so diving right into the RSA 79E. So this is a housing toolbox tool authorized by the innovative land use laws and 79E of the RSA. That essentially what it does is it allows the governing body of a town or city to identify a geographic area. You have to specifically in an ordinance identify what the geographic area is. In the case of a community revitalization tax relief district, it must be either a village center or a downtown area. So that one's more limited in its geographic purposes. And that one is geared mostly towards both the creation of new housing, but especially the rehabilitation of housing. And essentially what that does is a developer coming in can apply, when applying through this process, can, if their property is located within the geographic area designated, they can apply for what is essentially a freeze on their taxes at the existing rate for a time between 5 years and 10 years, depending both on what the town wants to authorize and what type of work is being done. For example, in the community revitalization, it's 5 years generally, plus they allow up to 2 more years if it's a historical building, plus 2 more years if it addresses workforce housing, and ultimately allowing up to 10 years. But again, that's at the discretion of the town. If the town doesn't want to allow that much time in a tax credit, then you don't have to give it. And essentially what that does is that creates some extra capital for developers or people that have existing housing stock that maybe might be coming into the market and needs to be rehabilitated to bring it up to higher standards, maybe transitioning from student housing into more housing more aimed at family and young professionals. This will allow them to not be taxed for several years on the additional value generated by the rehabilitation. So what this does is this gives them a little bit of extra money and extra incentive to develop that housing, and it doesn't permanently shut out that new development from the tax coffers. It gives you 5 to 10 years, and then all that new money will start coming in from that improvements in the tax rate. And so that's the first form. That's the community revitalization tax rate.
Before you go to the second one, can I ask a clarifying question? So you say in the VC, could this be the VC and the MFR as well, since there are a whole lot of potentially rehabilitatable structures in the MFR that are not the VC?
Even the single family?
What's that?
Even single family?
Well, I mean, it needs to be in that kind of core downtown, it sounds like. I'm not sure how far that extends out, but certainly the MFR seems like that might be doable. And if there was money available then, or tax relief at least, potentially rehabilitate rather than tear down some historic structures, that would be kind of interesting.
Right.
So
Exactly, that's exactly what this form of 79E was meant to do. And you are allowed to, well, the governing body is allowed to designate the area. Typically, it's because it does have that village center requirement. People tend to just say whatever the village center zone is, but you can set those borders with the caveat that it has to fit that need of the village center. So, you know, if you put one in the middle of the ag zone, there might be issues with the state if you tried to do that. But
But the MFR should be fine.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. My understanding of the law, that would be correct.
Because those are people who would be supporting the village commercial.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly, and there are stipulations in there that allow that this is meant to be addressing economic development and the creation of housing.
Right.
So, especially if you're able to couch your decision in that framing, then there shouldn't really be a problem with kind of expanding it beyond the actual borders of the VC district. And then the second form of 79E is what's called a housing opportunity zone. And the major difference between this zone and the other form, the CRTRD, is that it is not tied to a village downtown. Basically, what this one allows is, again, the governing body can basically just, as long as you say a geographic area and you specifically designate the geographic area in the ordinance that adopts this section of the RSA into your ordinances, then that area can be subject to it. And this unlocks up to 10 years of the same type of tax freeze, freeing up some extra space for especially mixed use, either vertically or horizontally. You know, just you have a parcel and over in one section you have commercial uses, in another section you have maybe some residential uses, and that's what this one is for. And this one is aimed specifically at the production of housing, as the name suggests. And so it essentially provides the same benefits of the community revitalization tax relief district, but it frees it a little bit more geographically to maybe with some other forms of overlays or something like that, really help encourage and drive development towards areas that the planning board identifies as desirable. By adding, in addition to the extra density bonuses from maybe some zoning overlays, adding some additional tax incentives.
Will, can I ask a question that I should know the answer to, and I'm sorry if you clarified this already. Does this tie in at all to, like, so the housing opportunity zone, defining it, does it reference the workforce housing law at all, and any of the affordability levels of the housing?
I believe it does. Yes.
And yeah, you get extra years on the tax break.
Okay, so
I mean, you could do mixed income, Alexis. You know,
Yeah,
it doesn't all have to be, quote, affordable, but, you know, it is intended to get at a multiplicity of needs.
Right.
So workforce is certainly part of that.
Right. And so one thing, I know when we talk about ownership, we're not just talking about single family homes, but going back to that point earlier about the need for single family homes under the workforce housing law, the affordability for ownership is defined at 100% of the area median income for, I believe it's a family of 4.
Right.
And, you know, assuming that a lot of that would be single family homes, I mean, that's like your habitat homes. I think you have at least 4 in your community that fit the workforce housing definition.
Right.
So, you know, that's a point to consider with where you would consider having that zone as well.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah,
it's,
exactly.
Thank you, Will.
and I think
No,
if
thank
this, I would say if this does go forward, I think it's really important to emphasize that these developments are not tax-free. We're just freezing the current level of taxes, so the town is not losing tax money. It will be gaining tax money in the long run, and for the time being, that's kind of remaining level.
Well, I think it's also kind of understanding that development itself is a public benefit, and when it doesn't happen because it's stymied, that's a problem. So the whole idea is to be able to incentivize investment in the community, and I think sometimes for sites that need that extra financial boost, there are related infrastructure issues as well. So when a developer has more capital, more flexibility with the capital up front, it just stands to make for a potentially better project. And in the end, you're going to get the tax revenue anyway, but meanwhile, you're also getting the other public benefits of investment in your community.
Well, I agree. I'm just thinking ahead to like
Yeah.
public discussions of taxes and all that kind of stuff. That will happen.
Hey, Will, you,
It will happen. It always happens. And even if you're not in the middle of a revaluation, it always happens.
Will, you made a couple comments that I just wanted to ask clarifying questions about. You
Please.
said that
Of course.
you said that it was for the creation of housing. So if it's a building with housing in it already, it automatically does not qualify?
No, my understanding of the law is that it applies for either rehabilitation or the creation of new housing in both zones. Again, the community revitalization is aimed more towards rehabilitation, and the housing opportunity is more existence neutral, if that makes sense, of whether you're rehabilitating versus not. The thing that the housing opportunity zone cares more about is that a percentage of the housing is reserved either for workforce housing or 80% of AMI, which is a little bit higher than the workforce housing definitions.
So how does the town calculate what is considered rehabbing an already existing apartment building? Like what percentage of the
So the
you
RSA
are
actually provides
rehabbing-
that.
Yeah, what is it?
If memory serves, it's 25% of the current value. So if you spend 25% of the current value on rehabilitation, it qualifies.
But the issue is that you don't pay the increased taxes on the additional value that you get with that. So like, let's say the tax appraisal goes up 50% with that 25%, you don't pay the additional taxes on that increased value for the
Set number of
for
years.
the number of years.
Locks you in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it went to the housing opportunity zone, who polices that in regards of income restrictions? Like, is that something the town is then regulating? The rent rolls of these private individuals' buildings?
Are you talking about the affordability of housing?
Yeah, so with the housing opportunity zone tax relief, you need 80% of the AMI or workforce housing price. So is that then policed by the town? If they're issuing those tax credits?
Continued affordability is always an issue with so like the city of Durango, Colorado built some workforce housing, and rather than sell it because it would just go into the market and go up to like $1 million a unit, they continued to own it and lease it to workers because they didn't want that was how they were going to control the affordability.
Right.
These were like, they made a big investment. They made these like a whole development of zero energy buildings specifically for seasonal workers, and they made a point of not selling them because they knew that they would just be snatched up for vacation homes. So like you have to own them to maintain that affordability.
That's excellent.
That's how the workforce
How it started.
If I could also just speak a little bit, I believe the RSA does require this, but also this is something the town could provide, requiring as part of that workforce housing or the 80% of AMI, that would be a deed instrument, so that would actually be included on the deed of the property when it was done, basically saying you cannot rent or sell this property for over the amounts outlined in the document. So there would still, there's always going to be problems with policing that, but there would be a legal mechanism enforcing that.
Okay, thank you.
So-
Thank you.
I can just
How
tell
do you
you,
like the
the
idea of
town is
selling
not
house
going to
with deed
police these
restriction?
developments.
Judy just said.
Thank you.
The town is not expected to police them.
Yep.
This is really interesting because Bruce was mentioning in our last housing meeting, and he mentioned it briefly, that the college is bringing back all their students on campus. So he's got a huge number of units that are not fully occupied. And when they bring the seniors back, if that happens, there's going to be a huge amount of availability in the downtown. And this type of grant or ability to not have a huge excess of taxes to renovate is a great opportunity.
It is. It
So
is.
should we start looking through these like one by one? And so I'm actually curious about the first one, amend the zoning ordinance to reduce what?
That doesn't bother me as much. The first one doesn't bother me as much because like there is a limitation that says you deal with the zoning that's more restrictive as long as the lot has frontage on a road in that zone. Like it's conditioned, it makes it so you basically like it makes a zigzag zoning boundary line basically, but like if there's no zoning on the more, or if there's no road frontage on it on the lot in the more restrictive zone, you don't have to deal with it. So like I think what we have works, and I think to redraw the zoning map would be a lot of work. Like I think that we could do it better, and I appreciate Will's offer, but I think we can make what we have works. We've had it work for a long time.
Where does it say
Lots in multiple zones. It's page 21 or something like that.
I mean, there's some big lots in Plymouth.
Yeah,
I mean,
they could be subdivided though, right?
Yeah, and then, that's a good point, that it needs to have frontage on the less restrictive lot in order for that
Yeah,
to
that's the
apply.
qualifying thing that makes it easier to implement.
Yeah. That does kind of make sense, as opposed to having a jagged line, I suppose, and having to redraw and.
Yeah.
Well, I
mean,
would
that
certainly
said-
suggest,
I think this is a
Going to
lower
do any-
priority thing for us in reality. Like, given all, I think there's a lot of great ideas you've given us, and I think this one takes a lot of work and gives us a little benefit.
I would just simply suggest that if you do go down the path of creating any overlay districts to encourage any type of housing development or any other kind of development, that you stick with lot lines.
Okay.
Okay.
Because you can lay an overlay however you want, and I would just say, don't repeat the problem of split lots when you create an overlay.
Okay.
So if we do overlays, it might just be to our benefit to redraw those lines, just to expedite that part of our changes if we make those.
If you were to do an overlay,
Okay, got it.
you let the overlay boundaries follow parcel lines.
Got it. So let's just keep this one on the burner for now, I guess. That make sense?
Unless somebody else really wants to go forward with it, I just don't see a huge benefit to it.
Well, I mean, unless we do overlays, in which case it might become more of an
Right.
issue.
Right.
Well, I think Judy was saying, when you're drawing the overlay,
Right, just
the
stick with
overlay
parcels.
boundary, right.
Yeah.
I guess where it could be an issue, Judy, though, is if the overlay is imposed on a lot that's in multiple zones.
But if but the way you write an overlay is, if the applicant wishes to develop under the rules of the overlay, the overlay rules govern.
Yeah.
Gotcha, okay.
Supersede.
Yeah, thank you, supersede.
Okay.
Yeah,
I like
I think
that.
what we've got is a really big list that, you know,
Right.
it's gonna be, I mean, we've pretty much said yes to everything up to this point, so dropping off some of the more complex stuff, especially if we don't see them being, you know, I think it's important, I just don't think it's a top priority compared to,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but I think where we would get a lot of pushback is, it depends on which side, where we're gonna move. You know, if we're turning that lot into something that's permanently more restricted, then that's gonna be a challenge, so.
Yeah, it might just be easier for now just to kind of either put on the back burner or maybe drop, but,
Yeah.
so.
I mean, that's why we're presenting a group of them, you know?
Yeah, and in fairness, we haven't really done mapping of that yet. So if we continue to work on that on our side and see that there might be areas where it is beneficial for some reason, we would be able to show you.
Okay.
But for now, we can table it and.
That sounds good. Adopt new zoning overlay districts in targeted areas that can support greater density to allow for mixed-use housing development and increased housing diversity. At our last housing opportunity, housing committee meeting, I asked about this and in regard to the difference between creating an overlay and just creating a zone, a different zone, or shifting zone boundaries. And I guess the overlay is easier in many ways, and it doesn't take anything away from anybody. My only concern there still is that in some places, I might want to take away certain things, but but for the purpose of facilitating housing development, the overlay serves a very straightforward purpose.
Right.
I mean, my only concern, I think, is like the conversation we were having earlier this evening, where given the opportunity to create housing or storage units is often a much quicker, easier bang for your buck than creating housing, a lot less complex in some ways. And do we want a whole lot of storage units because they go up easy and cheap rather than housing where we have water and sewer?
Yeah, I think that situation too is a great example of the challenges of the agricultural zone that really has the least restrictive regulations, and a true change in that neighborhood's character is happening or could happen there. And I don't want to talk too specifically about this one application, but all these uses are allowable in that zone. So.
And in that case, I mean, I deep down, I would accept an overlay, but I would actually prefer just the zoning change.
So, I mean, frankly, most planners would prefer to fix the zoning and not dump a lot of overlays on you. There's just a political reality is sometimes it's easier to sell an overlay because a person's existing use rights, which they understand, are not touched. And so it just often ends up being easier to persuade a community to try an overlay. But from to planners, it's become, ugh. Just really would like to avoid them when we can.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know. For me, I think I'm open to this. I think it deserves more discussion. I don't know that we're going to discuss, come up with a.
John, I would just point out that if you wanted to have a district in which you could require mixed income development, so that you could essentially require inclusion of affordable units, you really need to do an overlay.
That would be an inclusionary zoning ordinance.
Because you can't require it in New Hampshire. So you would have to do it through incentives in an overlay district.
Okay. And I think one of the questions you asked was, would we prefer it along Tenny Mountain Highway or along Fairgrounds Road?
Those were just examples that we were asking about.
Those are two that come up very often,
I think the overlays are probably going to be if having larger units or a greater unit number per building or per dwelling, whatever it's called. I think the overlay is the only way to move forward with that in very specific
easily in the
places.
short term.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder in the long term if you can take an overlay and like start to make it into a district after we try it out for a while, but
Try it before you buy it.
Yeah. What's that? Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. So I guess that one is probably gonna, I don't know, I'm thinking probably gonna require further discussion, but I think we're open to thinking, I'm open to thinking, I should speak for everyone. How do we, I can just keep talking, sorry. How do we feel about this? you seem open to thinking about it.
Open to thinking about it. It doesn't seem like there's a huge appetite for it here, but,
I think among developers, there might be an appetite for it to have incentive for greater density, which seems to be one of the barriers that many developers talk about. Like, well, I can't even think about coming to Plymouth because of the density barriers. And if we had
I know there's also,
incentives,
oh, sorry.
if we had incentives in these overlay districts for greater density, with certain guidelines in place, like design guidelines, whatever, I think that could be really a positive.
it seems like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's a master plan recommendation specifically about density bonuses in relation to affordability. And I think that's also kind of one way you can address that is through an overlay district. And, you know, here are these incentives for, you know, will allow you to have more density if.
Right.
Seems like maybe we need more information before we even decide to move forward with this. It's hard for me, hearing that makes me understand it a little more, but really knowing how that we would leverage that is, it's still not totally clear to me.
Okay, we can certainly provide some supplemental information for the board if you wish.
All right, that sounds good. Consider additional districts where two-family dwellings and manufactured housing could be moved from special exception to by right use.
Yep, I like that.
Of course, the difficulty is in the specifics. As a general idea, I think there's probably going to be some consensus when we talk about where.
Well, this is where you get to, at a subsequent planning board meeting, roll out paper maps and have crayons or markers, if you prefer, and start thinking about where you might want to do this and see how closely your markers align.
Yeah.
And just a reminder that manufactured housing is a very specific definition in our.
Yes, it does.
In our ordinance.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things, like, I can imagine, I mean, personally at least, even living there, I can imagine a duplex in single-family housing with design guidelines working just fine,
Yeah.
and I can imagine a lot of pushback, however, against against manufactured housing in single-family.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are state regulations around manufactured housing, I think, as far as what we can and can't regulate against.
Yes, that's
You can't
correct.
regulate it out of your town. But you know, it's come such a long ways. A manufactured house is basically a stick-built house. It's just brought in.
There's a range.
Yeah,
There is a range
Yeah.
still.
Any structure transportable in one or more sections, which the traveling mode is 8 body feet. There's very specific definition in here
Yeah.
what manufactured housing
there
is.
is.
I'm sure it's matching
And they
as
come in
defined
in-
in RSA
Yeah.
674 colon blah blah blah.
And they can move in 4 sections to make one house.
Yep.
All right, so I think in principle, we are good to go on that one. The difficult part is going to be, and why it's higher complexity, actually figuring out where and how.
Yeah.
Right, right.
That's not tonight.
No, not tonight, no.
You can just add it to the to-do list, no problem.
Right. We're setting up our schedule for working meetings for the next year or two.
Yeah.
Or 5.
No. In 5, we have to do the master plan.
Unless, if we get to start unless. Anyway, so the next one is about RSA 79E, and those districts for tax relief. And, I mean, from our discussion earlier, it seemed like there was some interest in this.
I've heard enough discussion about interest in conversion of student housing to single-family housing that this would be a financial tool that would encourage that. And
Or even other than single-family housing,
sure,
whatever it might be.
you know, I mean, if some of the triggers are based on, you know, affordability, but some might just, you know, I still think there's an incentive there.
That again is the difference between the two different zones.
Right.
Yeah.
So opportunity has the affordability requirements versus the community revitalization, which is geographic requirements.
I guess it might be good to think about, are we in favor of the community revitalization tax relief district? I think that's,
I'm more in favor of the community revitalization
okay.
than the housing opportunity.
I
There's
would
gonna be a
say I
lot
would
of-
agree with that.
Yeah. So how do we feel about the housing opportunity zone then?
So I have mixed feelings about incentivizing housing in the ICD, even if it's mixed use, even if it's second floor developments above retail, like, I guess, I mean, on one hand, it's affordable, I just don't know that, like, I don't know. I guess it's housing for workforce. I just can't imagine a lot of people seeking that housing out. I think it's gonna tend to draw more, I don't know.
It's, people have,
It's housing.
people are gonna have their vouchers and go wherever they want anyway.
I don't think this is just voucher housing.
No, I mean,
No, it isn't workforce housing.
it
This
could be
is,
expensive, nice second and third floor units over retail. I mean, it's not necessarily affordable. It doesn't have to be affordable.
Well, it's
just-
saying mixed income housing.
Yeah, but
Yes,
which means that
mixed means high and low.
Right, exactly, whereas not market.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not market housing.
No, it could be some are market, some are, have to be below to fit a certain, income standard.
And so it sounds like yes to the first one, and maybe we need more information on the second one? Does that sound?
Yeah.
I definitely
I
think,
guess I need to see examples like of successful implementation of housing opportunity zones and what type of housing that has come out of.
Okay, yeah.
This one admittedly is a newer program. This was only adopted in 2022.
Oh.
Yeah.
The community revitalization zones are considerably older.
Yeah.
So this was something we found. There is, the kind of the housing opportunity zones are still in development, kind of coming up, if that makes sense.
The other thing is if the places that we identified here, a housing opportunity zone along Tenny Mountain Highway, or if those are not where you would encourage such a zone, that's, another factor as well. I guess it's kind of two
Yeah.
questions. It's,
I just can't
we're comfortable with
imagine.
the idea of the housing opportunity zone, and then where does it make sense?
Maybe like the north. What's the area like north of the Baker River? I forget that zone, but like I could see that being a place for like retail with
Highway commercial?
the highway commercial zone. Like I could see that being a good place to have like some first floor retail, like with second and third floor living.
I guess one of the benefits here, and maybe there's another way of doing it as well, is that we're, I think, talking about ways of incentivizing density
Yeah.
as something you get for providing housing that's actually affordable to people.
Yeah.
And
I think it could work in places.
and I'm not, maybe there are other ways of doing it even besides the RSA 79E housing opportunity zones, but I think that's the goal, I think.
There's certainly other ways, and this could also, as I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, it would be entirely possible to kind of combine one of these housing opportunity zones with an overlay district, kind of give an extra bump to density, and then layer this on to really help drive and kind of direct development to areas that you want to see it coming in with these kind of overlapping benefits.
Right, and that's probably a very smart way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we need to think about that one and perhaps get some more info, and we'd like, yeah. Last on the list here, consider the implementation of improved design guidelines for OSRD and higher density residential developments. So I think we already said yes to the OSRD one. And higher density residential developments, I think implicitly the answer is yes, because we actually started to develop those in the planning board already in our guidelines. And I think they can be further developed and refined, including with housing types and stuff like that for different zones even. And so I think the board has already started to take steps in that direction in the past couple of years. And I think there's much room for improvement probably. I mean, if anybody disagrees, I don't know.
I just think it's always tricky. It's like, who's the judge of what is nicely designed?
I think,
Well, I think that's why we set up some guidelines to make it
But
as,
it's still gonna be,
it's still subjective, but to make it, because I think we did a lot of very specific things in our site plan review when we added those design guidelines in there, that they're clear things that we're looking for, so.
And it gives the developer, I mean, yeah, maybe a hurdle to go through, but also a clearer understanding of what the town wants. And what the town is gonna be excited about. So when they do propose something, they have an idea going into the process before they come to the board of what we're actually looking for.
And I think also with, looking at, the open space, that's what we're talking about, right? The OSRD?
And OSRD and higher density
Yeah.
residential developments.
But just specifically like for the open space thing, giving some, it's like, okay, we're just gonna, build this housing complex here in this dense forested area that we are gonna clear cut, and then just leaving this gravel pit as open space that's next to it, So trying to put a little more qualification on, what open space actually works. I mean, a good example is the place up above where we were today, where there's very, there's this open space, but these very slim connecting pieces that.
But the reason for that, I was very put off by that at first when I saw that on the plan. But when you think about it, it's a walking trail that leads to the water. It's really pretty cool what they did, and I commend them, and I wasn't excited when you just see it on a plan.
Yeah.
the same as the funded budget, which is general
I think that
education.
making sure that we're not just taking the least
like, we're
developable
spending as
land
much
and
to
putting
educate
it
special
in as part of an
ed
open
students, the small
space,
number
it's,
of NPR,
there,
the rest of
the
general
point is to concentrate density and leave space open, but if, it's like, oh, we're gonna have this wetland here, that, you wouldn't be able to put that you're not really accomplishing much, so.
It should be open space by design, not open space by default. And I think a lot of poorly written open space bylaws or ordinances are like that. It just becomes open space by default because you really can't do much else with it anyway, so we'll call that our open space. But the whole OSR, there's so much progress that's been made in OSRD type bylaws and ordinances that we have a lot to draw from. That I think we can really help the board think through some ways to get at what you're trying to get at. And, and not every OSRD needs to be on a large tract, on a large site that's going to result in a lot of open space. Sometimes an OSRD is really critical for a smaller property that may only have capacity for a few units, but what matters about the site is what you see from the road. And so the ability to sort of design a project, even a small one, where you preserve that view and simultaneously ensure that the developer gets the rights that they're entitled to for a number of units, those are all qualitative design considerations that a good OSRD bylaw will accommodate.
I think also reducing development cost as well by concentrating on a smaller.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah. It seems like we have a general consensus that we're good to go on that. All right.
I have a general question
Yes, Phil?
for the planners.
Yes?
So, I really like the concept of affordable housing. I think, there shouldn't be families struggling to house themselves. But I also recognize that the cost of education severely impacts our tax rate. And in so much as affordable housing may provide an opportunity for families of children with special needs to move to Plymouth, it has the disproportionate impact of really increasing our cost of education. So Amy and I recently stepped down from the school board, but Amy is currently still on it. Our special education costs, the line items for special ed are almost exactly the same as the line items for general education for all students. Like, it's 50% of the cost of education. and we're seeing a general increase in the trend of numbers of students with special needs in the schools. I think we should, my question is, have there been any studies to correlate? So let me back up and say, if education were funded adequately by the state government, this would not be an issue because 100% of education costs would be borne by the state. So if you have 80% of your students special ed, it wouldn't matter because all those funds would be coming from the state. But it's borne by the community because the state does not adequately fund education expenses. So, that in mind, has anybody done a study correlating changes in levels of affordability for housing within communities and the resulting impacts on special needs in education budgets?
So I'm sure those studies have been done. As planners, we have an ethical obligation to make sure that when we're advising communities on housing policy, that we're not going down the path of judging housing policy based on who's going to live in the homes.
I feel bad about bringing it up, but it's a real issue in this community.
And I understand that. All I'm saying is, as planners, it's not a path that we choose to go down because it is an ethical problem for all of us. We have responsibilities, among other things, for protecting people's rights under the Fair Housing Act. And
Sure.
we just can't help you with that question.
Plymouth
I would agree with that.
Plymouth had a,
You agree with that they can help us with that, or?
I agree that,
But the idea that we're gonna give tax relief to these individuals to create these facilities, rehab facilities, which if it's a $200,000 facility, all they have to do is pump $40,000 into it, and they've met the need for stagnant taxes for 10 years. Anyone in this community, if they look at their tax bill 10 years ago to what it is today, it's probably gone up quite a bit. So I'd like stagnant taxes for the next 10 years. So I think that would be another reason. It's just like taxes are a big issue in this community. So, you know, maybe 2 people end up qualifying for this. I have no idea, but that was the reason for my question of this is taxes are a real issue.
They
And
are
I'm
real.
not sure. If I had my way, I would be like, let's find a way to help the elderly with their taxes, not the developer that has a 6-unit building.
I mean,
But that's just me.
I fully understand that and agree in principle in many ways, but I also think as a planning board, we have to think not just about 5 years of taxes, but about the long term, and as long-term benefits of a short-term tax relief.
Yeah, I think with this focusing on the,
If it's worth it for the developer to pump the money into the building, it's worth it. They're not, the
And
little
by-
tax break is
and-
not going to make the difference to them.
And by creating more housing, though, if in fact this results in more housing, you're also reducing the scarcity of housing, which should drop the
Doesn't
prices
necessarily
and create
have to
affordability.
create more housing,
It
that's
doesn't
the
necessarily
point.
have to, but
It can just be rehab, it can be thrown on a roof, thrown in a, you know, redoing the kitchens in the units and you're in. It doesn't have to be a big, that's my understanding from what Will said.
so I think that the first one, the
You can
community.
spend
re-
$50,000 in a heartbeat today.
I would do that on my buildings.
Can I,
50 of $200,000. Go ahead, Rebecca. Speak.
Yeah.
okay, thank you. I think the community revitalization one is, I think if we specifically focus in the multifamily residential, it may cover an area of or this area that potentially is a threat of just deteriorating. And it sounds like there's a lot more nuance and flexibility in this than we know. So it I think maybe it doesn't have to be 10 years, or maybe there's some other adjustments we can make so we're not just rolling out the red carpet and say, hey, drop a new kitchen in this place and, you know, no increased taxes for you for a decade. I think we can maybe add a little more, we can add what our intentions are to this to make sure it's applying to what we need and not just making it easy for the developers who are indeed people too.
So, it's starting to get late, and we've had a really positive discussion here, and I think made a lot of headway. And before we close the joint meeting, I'm wondering if any members of the public would like to address these concerns that we're talking about with any comments? Yes. Please identify yourself.
Yes, Frank Miller. A couple of quick things. I believe part of the issue in the terminology of character is we should actually include the word style, because the style of a structure, which includes the size, the pitched roof, the material, the coating on it, collectively represents the character of a town or a neighborhood. I think that also helps the citizens and people understand what they're acknowledging, what they like the style of. I think also the real estate agency uses the word style in describing structures for sale. The other thing I think would be helpful is intent and purpose of each zone. We have in our zoning ordinance now on the front page the intent and purpose of our land use regulation. The first part is to protect the citizens, and that's done through fire codes, life safety codes, and such. And then the second is maintaining and preserving the environment, which is done through land use codes, which are different code systems. But in each one of our zones, there's an expectation of quality of living, which we haven't articulated to the citizens so that we can understand why we have 7 different zones in a town. So that might be a thought. And the second is, I know this is a long-term thing, but in redoing the zoning ordinance, we should have it, I would like to see, is that each zone of our 7 zones, all of the elements that are required for single-family residential zone should be in one section. You shouldn't have to flip through different charts to figure out parking or setbacks and uses and so on. This is a very confusing item. And the last one I'll say is under parking, that minimum parking of 125% is considered a technical infeasibility by zoning, by your codes and standards agencies, is that it is unreasonable because in our code system we have right now, a single family house has a minimum requirement of 2 spaces, and with 125%, you have to build 2.5 spaces. You can't have 3 spaces, you can't have 2, you have to have 2.5. Now, we've lost 3 court cases when people have challenged this and lost because it's unreasonable. So we need to just delete that term of 125% and put down 100%. If the parking states that you need so many spots per use of a type of structure, you should have the 100%. If you want less or more, then you approach the zoning board for the variance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Any further comments? Okay. All right. I also want to say to the housing committee before we break, I know there's a dwindling number, that I think it would be a good idea. I know we left it in the air on Tuesday to have a meeting next Tuesday to kind of continue some of this discussion, and those members who are here, does that sound good?
I think that's prudent, yeah.
I'll send a reminder out to everyone. Perfect, all right. So, members of the housing committee, would anyone even like to move to adjourn the housing committee? No, we still have some planning board issues to take care of, not very much though.
Make a motion to adjourn the housing portion of it.
Second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, you guys are adjourned. I just want to thank you so much, Judy, Alexis, and Will. It was tremendously helpful, and all your information.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all so much. I hope you found it informative.
Hey.
Don't forget those CRMs.
Yep, due Monday.
Monday, what
Thank
time?
you.
Monday, what time, Joseph?
Close of business.
Close of business.
Yeah.
COB.
Can we keep the rest of this fairly short? I mean,
Good night, everybody.
All right, good night.
Thank
And everyone.
All right.
I've lost steam. And
I know.
It's been almost 4 hours, so.
Oh, we started at
We started at 5:30.
We started at 5:30 today, didn't
Yeah.
we? All right, so we have a review of minutes. Everybody should have a copy of the minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as written.
We have a motion to approve the minutes. Is there anything else wants to say?
Second.
Okay, and we have a second. Is there any further discussion? All in favor of approving the minutes as written?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? All right, thank you. The minutes are approved from July 20th, 2023. Are there public comments not related to the business on the, we have public comments twice on here, Joseph.
Well, we want to hear from the public.
Yeah. It used to say at the discretion of the chair.
Let's actually,
That's a good one.
let's do that at the end here, at the second public comments. Hold on if you have any more. Communications received by the board.
Not at this time.
Okay. Reports of committees. Well, you've heard a lot from the housing committee. Any other reports from committees? I think you have an appointment again to talk to Rebecca, the,
Oh, yeah, the Energy Commission.
Energy Commission.
Next week.
yes.
They canceled their meeting last week.
All right. New business, I see none listed. Unfinished other business from board members, planning staff? Anybody got a 20-minute monologue? No? Okay. Public comments, not about items on the agenda.
The only public comment is a very productive meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, if anyone would like to do the honors?
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
Yeah.
And this, so we have a motion and a second to adjourn.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Hey.
And we are adjourned.